out there, and welcome back. This is My Grocery Adventure. I am Carly Wharton, your host. This is a podcast for people who want to make an impact. And we do call this the My Grocery Adventure podcast because a lot of the people that we interview do come from that grocery industry. And our guest today is one of the examples where he's not exactly a grocer, but he has worked adjacent to the food industry throughout his long and varied career. And today we're going to get to meet Dan Nagengast for the first time. He will rejoin us for future episodes as it's fun to get to tell his story of all of the various ways that he's made an impact in this world. And just from the teeny little bit that I've gotten to see, it's quite a varied buffet. It's a pretty wide variety of things that he has done and stories that he can tell. So without further ado, let us welcome Dan to the podcast. Hello, Dan. Good morning.
Hello, I'm happy to be here.
Oh, we're happy to have you. So this, for those who, haven't been behind the scenes with me and Dan, Jeannie, one of our most recent guests, is who put me into contact with Dan after I did her few episodes. She's like, do you know who you need to talk to? He's a great storyteller. No pressure, Dan. You need to talk to Dan. This guy, he belongs on your podcast. So she made it happen. She hooked us up, and about a month later, here we are. So thank you to Jeannie. Special shout out to her as well. And with all of our guests, we really take our time telling the long version of the story because we're trying to pull out the little nuggets of, right, how do you actually make an impact? What does it mean to live a life of intentional impact? That's kind of the heartbeat question driving all of these episodes. So as Dan tells his story today, we'll do our best to kind of pull out some of those themes, but we'll keep it super simple and start off with, Dan, tell us, where did you grow up and what was that like?
Well, I grew up 15 miles outside of a small town in western Nebraska called Potter, Nebraska. So 30 miles from a hospital, 30 miles from the bowling alley, 30 miles from the swimming pool, 30 miles from everything. In Potter, there was a school. And I consider myself to have been born on a cusp, although almost everybody, as you think about it, is born on a cusp. Things are always changing. But my older brother and sister went to a one-room schoolhouse, and I came along, 4 years later. And by my fifth year, I was riding the school bus with them. That 15 miles, really about 30, when you consider how the bus had to zig and zag. So an hour every day in and an hour every day out to school. We were primarily a crop farm, but also had some cattle and chickens. So in western Nebraska, there's not enough rainfall to do a crop every year. Now that's changed because they're mining the Ogallala aquifer. So where it used to be rectangles out there, it's all circles now with circle pivots. And the crops change too because they have much more rainfall. But at the time when I grew up, it was summer followed wheat, which meant half of your land was planted to a wheat crop in the fall. The other half was left standing. The stubble was left standing and plowed down in the spring. And then it was cultivated all summer long to try to build up and conserve moisture in that half of the land. So that come fall, you could plant a wheat seed there and there'd be enough moisture for the wheat seed to come up. So it's red winter wheat, which came from Ukraine and Russia. It did very well out there. It gives your fields, the half that are planted, a brilliant green all winter long in the midst of all the beige and tan and buff and the colorful colors.
Yeah.
And so that was our cycle, of farming. We occasionally did some safflower for safflower oil and flax and a few other things, but it was pretty much wheat or rye. Same time we had chickens. My mother, that was my mother's sort of portfolio, was the chickens, and she would get 150 chickens every, I don't want to say midwinter, like maybe February, and they'd be tiny little chicks, and we'd bring them in, and we'd had a brooder house, and we used to go out and sit with the chicks, for just because they were fun to watch. My mother, who grew up in Arkansas and met my father in L.A., used to go out there because she was about 4 miles from anybody and couldn't drive. And so while he was out working in the field, she would go sit with the baby chickens, she said, and cry. So, so that's the woman's life on a farm in Western, and she's not a particularly depressed person. It's just like there was nobody there. So those chickens would grow up, and they were unsexed, so they'd be male and female chickens. So you let them go at some point, and they run the farmstead. And there were 4 children at the time, and our job was to go find the eggs that they laid all over the farmstead. So we knew every nook and cranny of that farmstead. And late in the day, we'd go out there and come back, and occasionally you'd find a nest that we'd missed, and there'd be 25 eggs in there, and the eggs were still good. People don't understand that about eggs. It's the fact that we wash them makes us have to refrigerate them. But if you go to Europe, you'll find eggs aren't refrigerated. It's an American thing, and it's an industrial thing. It's because they have to wash them, make them spotless and nice and appear. But they do have a natural coating that prevents them from rotting. So we would collect all these pullet eggs, little eggs about this big, and we use them just like regular eggs, except you got 4 fried eggs for breakfast instead of 1 or 2.
Sure.
That's right. And we would start butchering the young roosters as soon as it became clear visually who a young rooster was. So stick your head up and you're in trouble, But their combs would grow and they'd start to be rooster-like. And so we'd start eating them. And those were 3 to a meal for a family of 6. So we'd have 3 fried chickens. But you had a lot of legs and thighs and breasts and the really good parts. But you ate the livers and the gizzards and the hearts too, and everybody enjoyed all that stuff. So and gradually all the roosters are gone, so you had the layers, and the layers would replace last year's layers. So those, again, it's my mom's bailiwick and my sister's, not me, but they had to do the work. We would help kill them, but then they had to do the work. I mean, the arduous work of pulling out the feathers and scalding them and eviscerating them and all that kind of stuff. And I always said, boy, they must have really liked chicken to do all that, But of course we did too.
Sure. Somebody's got to do it.
That's right. And then we had a freezer, great big freezer, and we'd stick them in the freezer. So we had all our own chicken for all year round. And we had cattle. We had 2 milk cows, Rose and Alice. You can sort of tell they were part of the family. And we had a bull who changed probably every 2 or 3 years, because at that time, this was another cusp. These were milking shorthorn cattle. They were a British breed that was good for milk and also good for beef. So it was a mixed breed. Now, I don't know, 98% of the herds in the U.S. are Holstein, because Holsteins give the most milk. They run them through 1 or 2 gestations, 1 or 2 calves, and then they send them to the slaughterhouse, and nobody knows their names. They're just functional parts of that system. So we've narrowed down all the genetics that we used to have into this one type of cow, and we're going to control anything that goes wrong with that, with medications and stuff like that. And of course, there is more medication. I think the dairy industry does a good job now of ensuring that there's, that there's contaminants are kept to a minimum. That if there's mastitis or something, they'll take the cow out of the rotation, and the milk doesn't get in. And same with if they have to be treated, they'll take the milk out of the rotation stuff. So we had to push for that, I believe, to get that to be a part, but that at least is there. Anyway, those 2 cows would have a calf every year because of the bull, and we'd buy a few more calves. And I recall one of the really great things about being a little kid on the farm was you could go down to those calves. They'd all be 3 foot tall. You'd be taller than them or just as tall as them, and you could put your hand up into their mouth, and they'd start sucking it, and they just keep sucking on your arm deeper and deeper. As a little kid, you're like, is this calf going to eat? Of course they wouldn't, but it's just like, it was just the strangest feeling. And, one of the weirdest things you could do, but we did that all the time. And the calf, it was the salt, I think, on these sweaty little kids' bodies that
Like a little snack.
yeah. So, minerals for both chickens and cattle are an issue. It doesn't necessarily come through straight up oats or things like that. And so there were always mineral blocks, and
Yeah.
mineral block for the chickens too. And they make, as they eat them, they make wild contorted figures, some of which have been sold in art galleries.
Like as a
At,
sculpture.
yeah.
Yeah.
They are really. They look like those slot canyons in Arizona with the red rocks kind of torquing, weird,
Yeah.
clearly water sculptured kind of thing. So
Yeah.
so anyway, those calves were allowed to grow up, and each of the kids got to pick one, and that one was sold at auction and went into our school accounts to pay for our college or whatever. Or it was our money anyway. So we all always were learning to have a little bit of, save a little money and that sort of thing. Then my father would buy at auction maybe 80 heifers or steers and run those out on the stubble and the wheat during the winter. Just run a electric
Mhm.
fence wire around there, and they would fatten up. We hayed we hayed in the fall and sometimes in the summer. And so, we grew all the forage pretty much. The oats, we grew the oats for the cows, that sort of thing. And we keep have those for 11 months or something like that. And then my father would pick the best one, and he'd go down to Potter, 15 miles away, where there was a butcher named Heinz Thomas. And Heinz was a German prisoner of war in Western Nebraska. And he said, I'm not going back to Germany. And so he stuck around and became the butcher in our hometown. His daughter, Doris, we call it. Her name was Dorcas, but we called her Doris. She was in my class. So he was a kind of genial old guy, and he was, very much appreciated in that town. And at that time, there were things called locker plants. There's very few of those left, but every little town had one. Had a butcher. You would bring in your steer or your heifer or your hog or whatever. You could bring in chickens, and in the case of cattle, they'd say how many pounds of hamburger do you want? How many steaks do you want? How many roasts? How many? They would do it exactly like you wanted. Wrap it in white paper, and you rented a locker. And the locker was it's like a morgue. It was this great big white, enamel thing that would pull out, and in there would be all your beef. So you didn't need to keep it at home, filling up a freezer. You had that in town.
Huh.
So that's a cusp sort of thing too. And that existed. I went away to college in 1969, and I would buy a quarter of beef for my dad, these frozen packages, and I'd take them down to Lincoln, Nebraska, which had a locker plant, a town of 160,000 at the time. And I rented a locker down there, and I'd put my beef in there. Now all that's just poof, it's
Yeah.
gone. All that's gone. The two milk cows, we would milk them, separate the milk from the cream. We had a little, it's called a separator. A funny thing. The name of the milker was called Surge, Surge. And anybody who grew up on a farm with cows, dairy cows, would know that name. And there's a real interesting lulling, the sound of a milking machine is, something like that.
Mhm.
And so you'd have the cows eating hay, and you'd have cats waiting, and you'd have that sound. You'd sit there. It was just a really quiet, placid time. We take the milk along with the eggs. We had a plywood egg carton that would hold, I don't know, maybe 12 dozen, so a big cube with layers. The milk and the eggs would go to Dalton, Nebraska, which was the town west of us. It was 13 miles away. And they had a grocery store there called Heiser's Grocery. And so we could take the eggs and the milk to them. They put the milk on the cream and the cream on the milk train, which doesn't exist anymore. And the
Yeah.
milk train I mean, sounds like something out of 1900, doesn't it? This was
Uh,
like
yeah.
1960. You put the milk on a milk train, it would go to Sterling, Colorado, and then I think it was bottled there and taken into Denver. So glass bottle, once it got to Sterling, and our cans would come back, the glass bottles would go, well, the cans didn't go. The cans stayed here. They poured it into some other receptacle. And then glass bottles into Denver, and then those glass bottles came back out there to that existed. The eggs were candled. And so what that means is you want to make sure people don't eat fertilized eggs in this country. Other countries, they eat fertilized eggs a lot, but in this country, they don't. And so it was just like a giant carousel with lines of eggs, on each of all the way around. And it would go in front of this extremely bright light. And you could see through the eggs to see if there was a developing embryo in there. That's what that was all about. And Mr. Heiser, who was the grandfather who started this thing, I remember this so clearly. He had lost these 3 fingers, so he had this. And I'm a, I'm a little kid watching this, and his hand is going, with this. I'm like, it's like the most striking thing in my life was watching Mr. Heiser put those eggs on those little cups. He was a good guy. So you got a credit for the milk and the eggs, which you used to buy your groceries in the grocery store. I mean, you generally bought more than that, but basically there was a barter or an exchange going on for all that. And so you bought cereal and you bought Jello and you bought processed foods, but you never bought any of that, any eggs or meat or that sort of thing. Maybe cheese. We didn't do cheese.
Were there lots of families in like around where you lived that were doing something very similar?
I think there were enough. Yeah. I mean, we were
Yeah.
not considered dairy farmers. We were just farmers. We had 2 cows. I mean, we weren't dairymen at all, but there was an outlet for that little amount of milk that we had. And we had Rose and Alice for maybe 12 years.
A
I
long
mean, a
time.
lot of gestations. They had, a lot of calves over a lot of time. And,
Mhm.
you got to know them. They got to know you, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Um, Also in that store, just a little sideline, there was a door in the back and you could go through the back and it was a dry goods store. Like you would imagine, in Deadwood in 1878, they had bolts of cloth and, big clodhopper shoes for farmers and notions and thread. And, it was just
Wow.
that kind of place. And so, I mean, that was still extant in 1960, 65, that
Yeah.
sort of. Um, in the summer, my mother had a big garden. And I always said she should have written a book called Gardening with Wind because Western Nebraska is just all the time, from the southwest to the northeast. And so she would put wooden shingles, cedar shingles. She'd put them on each side of any plant she put out there. So to the south and west, and so every plant, got a start because it just would not make it otherwise. And she gardened a lot. Um, So we had in the summer, I mean, we'd have 7 vegetables on the table with those itty bitty chickens, It was like there'd be all this stuff. We drive up to the North Platte River Valley, which somebody called it, some promoter decided to call it the Nile Valley. So it was called the Nile Valley in Scotts Bluff and Gearing, but no place else called it that. But they grew a lot of potatoes there. Now they grow sugar beets. And you could go to the field and there'd be these burlap bags, 100-pound bags, just sitting there in the field. And you'd go pick up 3 or 4 or 5. We'd buy 5, so 500 pounds of potatoes. We'd give one of those to our preacher in Dalton, and then you'd go pay $5 to the farmer. It was just,
Like
I
a
mean,
dollar for 100 pounds of potatoes?
yeah, a penny a
But
pound.
you got to go in the field and get them. Because
Yeah, you had to pick them up yourself and throw them in the. I mean, you filled the trunk full of potatoes is basically what
sure.
you did.
And
But
you gave one to the preacher because
yeah,
that's
well,
just
that was your tithe, part of your tithe.
okay. Here's some
Preacher
potatoes.
the preacher had family. Every preacher we had, well, one didn't, but most of had families and kids and stuff like that. And it was just it was a kindness or an appreciation or something. He also tithed money in the church,
Mm,
but it was
sure.
like, for $1, you look like a really generous person.
Getting it pretty far down the road for your dollar. Yeah. Yeah.
um, and then my mom canned, and she'd can all summer. So,
Mm.
carrots, all that kind of stuff. And then every fall when the fruit from Colorado started showing up, peaches and plums and pears, she would can all that stuff. I mean, she would have, we had, I mean, pears were never quite, they wouldn't be ripe or so she had this table downstairs in the basement with a blanket on it. And she'd put a whole bushel of pears on there, and she'd go check them every day or turn them. And once they got right, then she'd can those. And so we had a cellar. It was a cellar. It was actually our storm cellar. So there's the house was a little raised. Then there was a basement with a window to daylight, and below that, another 10 feet was a cellar. So you could get way down in the ground there, and that's where we hid when tornadoes came over and stuff like that. And then the steps were 19, 20 inches. And so mom would say, go get some tomatoes. And so you little kid, and there's one little light bulb way up there, and there's spider webs, and it was just, and so you'd have to like almost get around and ease yourself down the step and get around, ease yourself down. And then coming up, you'd put the glass jar, get all the way up. So that was one of the things we
He
did.
was happy to have you do that.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
The older she got, the better, or the
Sure.
more appreciated it. And I was 5 years old when taking care of the chickens became my chore, and so I would, I'd have to give them oats and water and check the oyster shells every day. Oyster shells was the mineral for chickens to help them create strong eggshells. So oyster shells were spread all over the Midwest and all over the United States. That was an agribusiness thing that had been around for a century or more. But anyway, I mean, so the oats buckets were 5-gallon buckets. I was 5, and if you know what a 5-year-old, the oat bucket came to here, and so I'd go down, and it was 250 feet down across the yard. So I'd go get an oat bucket, and I'd pull it out and set it down and walk around, get up, and there was no sympathy for that. It just that was my job. And then I did water. And so it's like a 4-gallon bucket of water, which was just so heavy. And that same thing, I just have to do that. In the winter, it would splash splash all the time on my leg. But in the winter, my jeans would just become frozen solid. So it was like crackling thing. And
Mm.
you better go feed the chicken. Okay, I just go do. There was no thought that it was inappropriate for a child to do that sort of thing. We did all that stuff. So that was and then as I got older, high school, go to a football game Friday night, come home Saturday morning, and I'd have a big steak for breakfast. I mean, I'd have what would be a $40 breakfast now. I mean, it was just that there was just. I mean, we had so much. I mean, the bounty was pretty amazing compared to, you go into a store now, and occasionally it gets up to $150 or $160, and it's like, I'm gonna get 4 meals out of this, maybe, and then I mean, there was a lot of better food available just from your own place. And Western Nebraska is not the garden spot of the universe. I mean, it gets 18 inches of rain a year, and yet you could do that at a time when I don't know, 30% of Americans were farmers. And 100 years before that, 97% of Americans were farmers.
I
You know,
was literally thinking about that this morning, like wanting to look up those stats as far as like now it's what, like 1%?
it's probably headed that way. Yeah.
It's so minuscule compared to like we all need it. The tribe is bigger than ever and there's fewer people than ever working on food.
Have you ever seen, Maslow's hierarchy of needs?
Yes, but
Yeah.
refresh us for those who don't know.
Well, there's what humans need, and it's a pyramid, and at the bottom there's like food and shelter, things that they need, and then human companionship and, all this kind of stuff, gets to a point up there. If you look at what you would think that occupations for humans would reflect that. If this was what you'd think everybody would be involved in growing food or building shelter or, the things that are on that bottom, that's what humans need. And we've invented a way to make very, 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 very few people involved in what we most need. And so you sell insurance or, or you're an influencer or, you're out there dancing somehow to try to find a living. And there's a lot of intergenerational strife about that. It's like, yeah, you guys had, you had all this and you had all that, but it's not really just the generations that did it. It's our system did away with all the meaningful stuff as human occupations and gave us all this peripheral, abstract, in some ways, not real, sort of things that we can do. It's sort of, I don't wonder why there's ennui in the United States. It's just like there's just not a lot of stuff that means anything anymore. I mean, fishing used to be something that meant something, but it's just, how many influences out there do we need? It's or TikTok people. It's sort of like there's no substance in there. It's like what can I do today that will get a bunch of eyes to look at this, and then I'll sell advertising to that. And it's sort of like that's not satisfying. And I don't include your blog in this at all. I think
Oh,
you're
I don't take it like that. I
yeah
I think
yeah
there's a lot of people out there who are, like you're saying, like looking for something meaningful,
hmm
because the meaningful thing used to be feeding yourself.
hmm
And now there's so much automation and technological advancement that, I mean, what used to take you sitting out there milking your cows, I mean, now then there was a machine for that. Now there's whole machines that, like, you don't even have to hook it up. There's a robot that'll hook it up for you, like
hmm
taking more and more labor out of production agriculture. And there is a lot of ways where, yeah, that's great. And it's a sign of the times and it frees us up to do other things. But I think there's a real link between free time and depression.
hmm
People weren't depressed 100 years ago, or not nearly as depressed, simply because they didn't have time to be. They were surviving, they were meeting their low level hierarchy of needs, they were focused on how do I put food on the table. And then once life gets to a point where it's easy enough, you got time to think about all kinds of things that, like, just really aren't your business.
hmm
Like, I love the saying, like, there's your business, there's the other guy's business, and there's God's business.
hmm
And there's a lot of people trying to mind business that's not
hmm
theirs because
hmm
they have a lot of free time on their hands. And what we're seeing right now is, right, a lot of different people's best guess at what do you do with this much free time?
hmm
What do you invest it in that actually means something?
hmm
And that is ultimately, I think, what this podcast is even trying to answer. Like, how do you live in today's society where you do have so much free time that it's almost overwhelming how much choice you have?
hmm
That, like, you can do anything, but
hmm
then people get stuck right there. Like, well, I could do anything. I don't even know what to do.
hmm
So finding your way to what do you actually do when you don't have to spend all your time meeting your most basic human needs? Yeah, that's a hard question. Harder for some than others, but it
Yeah.
gives you a lot to think about.
I've given that pitch in talks at times, and people that were older than me came up and said, I lived through, they'd be 30 years, 40 years older than me. So the generation before, and they said, I lived through that and I would never go back again. And of course, I was in a sweet spot compared to the first people out there trying to, you know, not only did they not drive, no cars, I mean, it was hitch up the horses to go someplace. And of course, there were Native Americans who lived out there before I mean, that land was settled in 1878. And before that, it was grass. And there was one little wet seep there that if you dug, you could find water, which meant probably people, used it during the summer. They would go out and they would be hunting out there, and and then we'd have all kinds of stone tools that I found, around there. So people used it to make a living, and to me, it sounded kind of sweet then too. That you know being out there in a little camp and you know eating rabbits and that kind of stuff, and it would have been all right. But then
Business.
showing up, plowing that all down, finding out about grasshoppers and drought and all that kind of stuff and dust bowls.
Mm-hmm.
That was not the way to do it, and it wasn't sweet. It was pretty miserable, and a lot of people left during that time and became Californians, which was sweet, I'm sure. But um, I was just there at a time, like I said, it was a cusp, and you things were pretty good. There was really no, everybody was sort of middle income.
Yeah.
I mean, the richest guy in town would be the banker, and they were barely richer. I mean, it didn't show. Maybe they were socking it away or something. But their kid had a newer car, that kind of thing. But it wasn't. So there was a lot of sort of equality.
Yeah.
It was a white place. There was a lot of issues from elsewhere that it's unfortunate that we didn't have other people to get to know, because I think it led to generations of, just not silly, vicious anger and hate about people you don't even know. It's just sort of
Fear of the unknown will drive people to do some really weird things. And yeah, like when you just don't know, exposure is really the best medicine for that. And in some places in the world, that just was not a thing. Like even in the place I grew up, I mean, there was hardly any exposure to diversity. And that was the 90s, So I mean, like there are pockets of that where unfortunately it's just not, fortunately, unfortunately, whatever, it is what it is, but like it's just not there, and it leaves it to those people to seek it out if they will, if they'll expose themselves on purpose through choosing to go somewhere else where that is. And some people choose that and some people don't. And yeah, I think those who choose it can do their hometowns a big favor by expressing like, what was it that travel did for you? How did it open your eyes to meet people from different cultures or different backgrounds? Like, what was cool about that, and share that.
My mother grew up in Arkansas in the Depression, so dirt poor. She said if it wasn't for bags of beans and cornmeal, her family would have died. I mean, that's what they had to eat, or poke salad if they could find it in the spring.
What's a poke salad?
Pokeweed is a weed that grows in the cracks. It's poisonous if you eat the wrong parts of it, but it's a really tasty salad otherwise.
Okay.
It's a that most people avoid, and food systems avoid and stuff
You're
like that.
you're eating it if you have to, it sounds like.
Greens have been eaten for years, but,
Yeah.
and in
Okay.
other cultures they still are, that sort of thing. But she grew up integrated in a neighborhood where everybody was poor, and I won't go into that story so much, but she grew up with black people and new black people, unlike most white people in Western Nebraska. And she said she always said that black people in the South, or white people in the South, had black friends but hated the race, and white people in the North loved the race but had never met a black person. And
I could kind of see that.
some of that in there, but she got Ebony magazine, which whatever the publishers, of Ebony magazine thought, if they ever did a map out there in the panhandle of Western Nebraska, there was a pin,
Yeah. Yeah.
She tried to teach us there are other people in the world. My dad was really quite interested in the Sioux, actually, and read a lot about it, had a lot of admiration for the people that were there before us. So we didn't grow up thinking we were the cock of the walk, as they say. There was nothing special about us, I don't think.
Mm.
So that was my growing up.
How many people did you graduate from high school with?
22.
22. Okay.
And so the catchment for that was probably 30 by 30 miles.
Okay. Wow. And only 22
Yeah,
people. Yeah.
all at the age. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And same building from kindergarten through high school. All 22 are still alive, by the way. We had our 50th reunion. First time I've been back. First time I've seen most of them in 2019 was our 50th reunion. Everybody was still alive.
That's got to be rare.
That is bizarre, isn't it? Yeah.
I mean,
Even accidents should have taken some of them. You know.
it did for me. And yeah, I haven't made it near that far, but yeah, dang it. That's awesome. Got a
Yeah.
lot of good reminiscing, I'm sure,
Yeah.
back then. So, okay, so then 1969, that was when you graduated high school.
Mhm.
Okay. And it sounded like your parents had the value of at least teaching you how to save your money, whether you were going to spend it on college or not. That was
There was,
something that they tried to do.
there was never any doubt that we wouldn't go to college. All that was just there
Did
was
they
no
go to college? Your
no.
parents?
My
Either
my
one of
father
them?
had an eighth grade education. My mother went through high school. So, and they were both bright, but my dad was born in 1909, and he was working by the time he was,
He was
you know, what
prob-
teenager, a young teenager.
he was
He was
probably his own little 5-year-old boy with his big bucket of water trying to get it across the yard.
but there were, I think, 10 or 11 kids there instead of,
Yeah,
so it went from 11 to 4 to 2. And like my younger daughter says, she'll never have kids. So maybe it's going to 0. I read the other day where the demographics on China are that they're going to have about half the people in less than 100 years that they have now, down to 750 million people, because
they squashed the birth rate.
yeah, now they're upset about it and they're trying to figure out how to
They're
make
like,
women.
come on, guys, you can have two now. Like, thanks, I'm good, actually.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, right. There's a lot of countries in that boat where
Well, those kind of statistics, I, I mean, they sort of give you some hope because they all are projections out, and the other projection is here it's going to be 2 degrees hotter and everything's going to go to hell. But then there's all those things that enter into that, and there's some really good numbers entering into that says, well, yeah, if you project that we keep doing what we're doing and the way we're doing it forever, yeah, it's going to be hell. But not all the projections say that we're going to do that. I,
they're
I
right. There might be some trends headed in some different directions.
Well, when you consider we had something like less than 2 billion people, I don't know, at the turn of the last century, and now there's approaching 9 billion people, and there's less hunger than there was. So that green their evolution, love it or there were a lot of things, and still are a lot of things really wrong with it. One is its energy consumption. I mean, it's all nitrogen fertilizer and stuff like that. But it did do something, and it did allow us to feed, better a lot of people, which of course we as humans then say, oh, well, let's have more kids then. It's sort of like you build a highway. Oh, we can drive more. It's like humans, they don't, they don't understand the idea of plateaus or sweet spots. That here's an economy that's taking care of everybody. It's running along. It's like something in humans, individually or as groups, makes them unhappy or discontented, I guess. And if somebody could figure out how to slap some contentment into people, I mean, people are discontented who have things and access and comforts that most of the generations for 5,000 years would have just been agog at how lovely this would be. And yet, how many people are unhappy? It's like,
More than ever,
yeah, I know. It's
truly.
really, yeah.
And so, yeah, you go back to like freedom of choice, freedom of time. Like there's a catching up that I think we're doing as a population as far as like how to how to navigate this much freedom. Like
Yeah.
never before in the history of human civilization have we been this free, as far as we don't have to spend our time making food and creating shelters. Like that's, it's not done, we're always doing it, but there's so much infrastructure there that
Mhm.
leaves us free. And then what do you do with it? And a lot of people are minding other people's business, aka they're fighting online about crap that doesn't matter or
Yeah.
whatever it is. They don't know what to do with their amount of freedom. And so it kind of comes back to the heartbeat of this podcast is like, how, what does it mean to live a life of intentional impact? How do
Mhm.
you actually take your freedom and translate it into you're helping make the world a better place?
Mhm.
Maybe not all at once or overnight, but little by little by little, you're doing something with your time that is at least trying to point in that direction, you know? And I
Mhm.
think a lot of people just spin in their freedom and don't really know what to do with themselves, kind of lack direction, lack
Well,
a vision of what they could be doing.
there's a failure of imagination there too. I mean, not everybody, looks at a situation and goes, "Oh, that's not right. What can I do to change that?" Most people get mad at it, or move away. Well, I mean, there used to be an option for a disaffected young man to head to the gold fields. I mean, or head to the prairie. I mean, there used to be, I don't like it here. I don't like what's going on. I'm just going to move there, and suddenly I'll be a productive person, even though I'm just chasing gold in the ditch. It's like, and I may not find any. It's sort of like there were things that you could do if society wasn't ringing your bell, and they were roughly they were acceptable. They were it wasn't you weren't being the most responsible person in the world, but there were other responsible people right alongside you, and so yeah, you can that can rub off on you, that sort of thing. And now, I mean, the big deal in Lawrence right now is homelessness, and I would say half of them are legitimately people down on their luck, or they have mental issues, or or they were single moms, and you know, he bailed, or there's that kind of thing. And then there's a whole crowd of other people, young, generally men in their 20s and 30s and 40s, who are just that this is their occupation. This is this is what they want to do, and it's starting to cause problems. Lawrence, the little blue dot, is starting to say we can't do this anymore. It's just we just had an election last night. I haven't looked at the results, but I think city commissioners changed all of that, and it's probably going to be a harder line of some sort, just because it's been such a, the homeless population in Lawrence doubled, or 50 went up 50% in 6 months, something like that. It was a really strange figure, and it's per capita, it's really high, and it's because it's tried to be, a town that was going to help people. It was trying to be a caring community, and so you're caring for some people, and then there's these other guys that go, "Oh, that's sweet," and and they move here. Lawrence doesn't. You can't get arrested for smoking a joint now. So people who want to smoke joints out in the public can do that. They just come here. Portland's got the same issue where they have no drug laws, and they're starting to get just inundated. So it's like, I think we're getting off point of your podcast.
Dude, we're always on point. It's all good. It's interesting how, yeah, there's like an aimlessness in the world right now, like in the collective. There's a lot of people who, like, if you've heard in the, I think it's in China where they're having the lie flat movement, where like the young people, they're like, I'm not gonna participate. I'm not gonna do that. I'm not gonna take out the mortgage. You can't make me get married. I'm not having the kids. Like, I'm not going to do that.
I don't want to do it. Yeah.
I'm not going to carry on this status quo.
Yeah.
And is really concerning for a lot of people. Like, oh my gosh, like what are they going to do? But it's like, at a certain point, sometimes the status quo isn't exactly worth continuing, And so there's a lot of people who are angry. There's a lot of people who are opting out. And I personally don't think that that's completely unreasonable, that
Oh,
they're choosing these things. But again, it's like there's a lot of people who then build a house in anger and they just retire there. And I'm like, no, like you can pull back from what you're angry about, but then redirect at, okay, so then what? What do you want to do? What do you want to be? What do you want to make? What do you like? What? What do you want to do? So yeah, not just getting mad at what is that's not working, but truly like how can you contribute to making something that's better then?
well, one of the things about agriculture was you always had to take care of whatever it was. You had to prepare the bed for it. You had to nurse it through its birth, or it had to be germinated. You had to weed it. You had to protect it. You had to, I mean, you had to go outside yourself to care for your livelihood.
Yeah.
You know? And is that different than I've got to be at work at 9 and make 50 phone calls today and then walk out, and then tomorrow morning I got to be at work at 9 and make 50 phone calls. And somebody's going to judge me on how well I made those phone calls. And it's sort of like, yeah, there's a disconnect in the Mennonite kids I used to know said something about the way you spend your day is the way you spend your life. And it's like,
They've
there you
got a
go.
point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like how many people sit around in their life killing time,
Hmm.
like I'm waiting for this next thing. And it's like waiting, 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 waiting for what? Like
Yeah.
you're the one you're waiting for.
Yeah.
You doing it. And that's something that agriculture, it requires that kind of a mindset, like you're saying, of like there's a whole system that has to come into harmony for you to get a harvest. And a
Hmm.
lot of the harmony of that system depends on you and the choices you make on a daily basis.
And you can look at two farmers side by side and say, that one's getting getting after it, and that one's not.
That one came up with the idea to put the little shingles in front of the guys so that they could like actually sprout up. Like that one took the time to make an individual windbreak for 1,000 plants in their garden or whatever it was. Like the investment that you put in determines the harvest you're going to get. That's something that people in food, they understand that. Like you can see the result of your labor. It's very tangible.
Hmm.
And so yeah, I think that's again where the podcast itself is about making an impact, but talking in food systems, grocery, agriculture, it makes it very real why you showing up, you doing your part, you tending your garden, whatever that is, I don't care, get your harvest, like you do the work and you get your harvest and let everybody share. Oh,
Sorry.
no, that's okay. Let everybody share is really the best part, as far as like, you bought 5 bags of potatoes and you took one to the preacher.
Hmm.
You were able to give because the bounty was so good from the harvest that you all were able to create, from the effort you put into it, and then you share what's extra. And like that's what I would love to see, is everybody with their own garden, whatever that is for them, tending to it, harvesting the value from it, taking some for themselves for a life well lived, and sharing the extra with people who maybe don't have as much right this minute. Like it seems so natural and normal to think like that, but it's
Yeah. So
not
many. Yeah.
it's
So
not
many
common.
people. Yeah,
Yeah.
and so many people, that sounds really yucky to them. I mean,
Or at least foreign, at
yeah.
least like not practiced.
I
Like
lived in a lot of other cultures, and that's probably the next podcast. But I spent a lot of time in Africa in small villages doing food system stuff, and um, in the late 70s, 80s, there was awareness of the larger world, But I remember trying to call home once at 3 a.m. at a satellite dish in Liberia. So that's how you communicated to the U.S. There was some kind of an American satellite dish there for probably nefarious reasons, but they would allow a Peace Corps volunteer to walk in there and make a phone call at 3 a.m. So you could do that. Now every person almost in Africa has a cell phone, and they can call me right now. I mean, maybe that was even they can call me right now, and so there's a real awareness of how other people, what other people have and what they don't have. I mean, they don't have running water, and so you have kids in villages who have, if they thought about it, have a pretty satisfying life, but
Hi, Kitty.
but that's not what's tempting them. Their satisfying life of growing white rice or wheat is not. That's not. They're looking for, how do I get out of this and into that. And it's true in China too. I mean, there's that's and what that does is it gets you longer life. It gets you I mean, longevity. It gets you probably a healthier life. It gets you comfort. I mean, those are not things to diminish. People want that and people need that, and so you know I was thinking this morning about 200-300 years of colonialism, how basically everything that was worth anything was being taken. I mean, if you start with slavery, let's start with there. They were taking people, they were taking products, they were taking minerals, everything about Europe's interactions with the rest of the world was, what can we drag back and make $1 billion on? I mean, the East India Company. I mean, all that stuff. The Astoria and the beaver pelts and all of it was about, how do we take the wealth from this place and drag it back somewhere else. So those countries get independence in 1960, and they go, well, we'd like to have a national airline, and we'd like to have a railroad system, and we'd like to have hospitals. And so they would try to build it, and they didn't have the money to buy the fuel for I mean, the countries had been so depleted of resources that they would try to have these Western things because, their president had a plane and he was flying in a nice suit to, London or somewhere, or Paris. And that's how people lived. And it's like, oh, wow, yeah, this is what we need, but it's like all the money, all the money was taken there for them to do that. And there's nothing here now for you, and that's a reckoning that I can see it coming, because, Africa is going to have the most people of any continent on the earth, probably in our lifetimes, and they're going to be young. And so they're going to have more, it's like, and why should they put up with that? Knowing that even to this day, all the gold and diamonds and oil and stuff like that, cobalt, they're paying kids, pennies on the day, and it's going to make the battery for my next car.
Yeah.
So it's, I don't know. There's a real conflict in modern life and bringing everybody along, and food is only part of it.
I know. Food is, I think one of the reasons I like it is because it's unifying. It's
Yeah.
like it doesn't matter what continent you're from or what year you were born or anything. Like we all need to eat every day, like
One of the
ideally multiple times a day for this one. But
one of the interesting things going on right now that feeds into this is the whole idea of cultural appropriation, and I'm going to smudge my house, or I'm going to go, all this kind of stuff. And it hasn't gotten to that point about food, but isn't me eating Chinese food cultural appropriation? I mean, the various cuisines of the world, I mean, they're so wonderful. You want to share them, and they, I think they'd like to share it too. But then there's this political idea of cultural appropriation, where I understand where it came from because there's, why should white people get all the money from rhythm and blues? They didn't invent it. It's like they appropriated it. They liked it.
Mm,
So I think there's just a lot of groundwork that needs to be done on people understanding and appreciating everyone,
yeah.
and understanding what justice is for all of them too.
Yeah. Unification, like I think there's a big difference between ripping something off, like you plowed in there and you took it and then
Mm-hmm.
you're profiting off of it. Like
Mm-hmm.
that, taking things by force is never an okay thing in my book. But there's like something else that says, like you're saying about food and art and practices and wisdom, like there's so much in so many different cultures that why can't we share? Isn't sharing caring? Like, aren't we supposed to share? Isn't that something that,
Mm-hmm.
we like as humans, and we teach the children in kindergarten to like share with their neighbor. And
Mm-hmm.
then when people grow up, they like get all greedy again and just keep it for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I think there's a potential to open it up and realize that like there's value in every culture, and maybe the human civilization gets even stronger and better the more we share, the more we learn from each other versus trying to figure out like how are we different? How, I don't want to be like you, or you're over there and I'm over here, like you're the other.
Mm-hmm.
Again, we all eat food. We
Mm-hmm.
all breathe the same oxygen. Like we're just trying to have the best life we can have. Like
We're all there at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
a couple days with no food and we all revert back to the same animal that's hungry. Like that's just all there is to it. So there's a part of me that's really comforted in the food industry as far as like it's kind of the great equalizer. Like none of us have evolved to a place where we no longer need food. And
Mm-hmm.
so in that place, like there is a real human connection that I think is already there for those who want to tap into it. And then there's a lot of people who are paying attention to lots of other things.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think we got off track here at all. I loved every bit of this, and I cannot believe that that was a whole hour already. So I think we will wrap it up there, but we will be back. We will pick it back up as far as wherever we left off. As far as I think when you go to college, did you go to college right after high school, or was there
I
a
went
gap there?
I went from kindergarten through law school without a break.
Without a break. Okay, so yeah, we'll be picking it
I
back up.
almost didn't miss a class.
Dang, you were serious.
I didn't know what I was wanted to do during any of that. So there you go.
Yeah, thought you
Just
better pay attention, see if
I go
you
to school. Yeah.
see if they teach it one day. Maybe you'll figure it out what you're supposed to be doing. I felt very similar. Like I better learn it all because I don't really know where any of this is headed. So yeah, we'll pick it up there next time as far as going to college and law school and Africa, the Peace Corps, all of that's still coming up. And that's just your 20s. That, I mean, so we got lots to cover, and I'm super excited for how we're going to get to hear your story, and we're probably going to be doing a lot more conversations like what we did this time as far as how does it connect with current living on this planet. What is the current state of things, at least from what we can see. We're just a couple people sharing our thoughts. So I enjoyed this. I hope the listeners did too. I hope you did too. Dan, thank you so much.
All right.
It was absolutely wonderful.
Let's make a date for the next one then.
Yeah,
That's not
absolutely.
okay.
Absolutely.
All
Thank
right.
you so much.
You bet. Bye.
Hello out there, and welcome or welcome back. I am Carly, and this is My Grocery Adventure, a podcast for people who want to make an impact and who have ever wondered how the heck do you do that? How do you actually put that into practice? That's what we're talking about here in short version. And today, this week's episode, we are rejoined by Dan Nagengast. Hello, Dan. Thank you so much for being here. We are going to pick back up with where we left off in the last episode. For those of you watching, it was just a week ago that Dan's first episode came out on the channel. For Dan and I, though, it's been 3 weeks. So we're jumping back into the conversation that we refreshed ourselves where we're even at, and we're picking it back up at the end of his high school experience. There was the assumption that he would go to college, even though his dad had an eighth grade graduation. Is that right? And your
Yeah.
mom finished high school.
Mhm.
Um, but all the kids were we just thought that they were all going to go to school. So I thought that was like a really beautiful thing that my parents also had in common. They didn't really go to college or anything, but just kind of always thought that that was what their kids would do. And they saved a lot because of that intention. They carved it out for us on purpose and sacrificed some things along the way to make it happen. So just a huge thank you to any parent who has ever built a foundation that lets their child go a little bit further than they were able to in their life, feeling very grateful for that today for some reason. Um, so that means that as you were coming to the end of high school, I think you said last time, did you know what you wanted to do or no? Really didn't have any idea?
I have never known what I wanted to do.
Still don't know. What to this day? Yeah.
Opportunities arise and or things feel like something I could tolerate or enjoy doing, and I've rarely had something I really hated to do that I did for very long. So I just
Yeah.
moved away from any of that kind of stuff,
Yeah. Dude, I get that.
including being a lawyer. I mean, I went to law school kind of randomly. It's like, what next? Well, I guess I'll go to law school. But in law school, which I enjoyed very much, I found out I did not want to be a lawyer, and so I walked away from that.
Oh, see, that's like a question I would have is like, why was law school enjoyable, but being a lawyer would not be enjoyable? Like, what's the difference, I guess?
Oh, the difference was, um, I was in New York City. I had 300 classmates. They were all exactly half of them were smarter than me, and half of them were slightly less smart than but
You're like right in the middle.
all of them could surprise you or blow you out of the water, that sort of thing. They were of all different races, creeds, colors, backgrounds. Uh, I mean, there were some that had been in private schools from age 3 through college. There were others that came out of, I don't know, Mississippi, and were clearly smarter than everybody else in the state, and Columbia snatched them up, that sort of thing. There were there,
Mhm.
and we all were thrown off balance by law school. Law school was, at the time, I don't know if it's, I mean, that was 50 years ago, but at the time, it was all Socratic method, and you walked into class, um, knowing you were going to be grilled by somebody who was even smarter than all your classmates, you know, to just sort of put you on the spot, and it was like an outward bound thing. It was like everybody was not able to stand up all the time. It was like you're not sure on your feet, and so it was you're in it together with a bunch of people that you would probably not having anything in common with, but you found yourselves bonding or that sort of thing. So it
Yeah.
was, so I enjoyed that. I enjoyed a lot. I didn't enjoy the grilling so much, but I got through it. I remember I had he was a corporations professor. Columbia had 300 students in my class, and about 30 of us, about 10%, were real interested in, criminal defense or poor people's law or, those sorts of housing issues, sort of not corporate law. And Columbia was, as we affectionately called it, the breeding ground for the running dogs of Wall Street. As the Chinese would have called it, it was there to build corporate lawyers and or to crank out law clerks who are going to go clerk for Supreme Court justices and those sorts of things. And I was interested in taking sociology classes at the same time, all this kind of other stuff, and managed to, you know, carve out my own little path through law school. But everybody had to take corporate law, and there was a guy named Harvey Goldschmidt, and he'd written the textbook and pretty well known in those kinds of circles. And I just really did not enjoy the class, so I would skip class, and then somebody would come up to me at lunch break and say, Goldschmidt called on you today and you weren't there. He's going to get you tomorrow, that sort of thing. So I go home and I just study my butt off, about whatever topic we were on. So I wouldn't embarrass myself the next day. And I went through, the whole thing, and all the exams at Columbia were blind. They had no names on any of the exams. So you got the grade you got um, based on how well you did on the exams. Plus, there was a few little things you could do to make yourself known to a professor at some time. And I did okay in the class, but just oh God, your professor's got it out for you and he's going to get you tomorrow kind of thing. It was just part of law school.
It's like boot camp or something.
It
Like,
was. Yeah.
dang.
And at the same time, I'm in New York City, like as far away from the panhandle, 15 miles outside of a town of 300 people in the panhandle of Nebraska as you could ever be. And
Right.
at the time on the Upper West Side, I remember this number, there were 92 languages spoken on the Upper West Side. I mean, it was just like, everything's going on. And it was just a banquet, of Little Italy and Chinatown and the Puerto Rican Day and there's just on and on and on and on and on and that kind of stuff. And the only loan I ever got for school, I think my second year of law school, I got $2,500 just to screw around in New York City. It was I took out a loan to join New York City. I didn't have any money to go to that many shows or that kind of stuff, but so that's the one loan I got was to
Was
just.
that a hard decision to take out that loan, or was it an easy decision?
Oh, I wanted to enjoy myself.
I want
So
this.
yeah. And
I'm having
I
it.
just didn't have money. I mean, I had just about exactly enough money to do tuition and board and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
But the,
So
so this
so what
this
did you
was
do with your $2,500? How'd you spend it to
oh,
enjoy New York?
I would go downtown, listen to jazz, or you know, um, go watch movies. I went to dozens of Broadway shows, and at the time, you could get SRO, standing room only, or student tickets for $4 to see a Broadway show. I mean, it was pretty reasonable. Go to Radio City Music Hall and watch the Christmas program.
So cool.
I once got to hang out. I had a friend who worked at um, where did she? What was it? Lincoln Center, and she said, "You want to come meet the Rockettes?" And I said, "Sure." So,
Yeah.
so I mean, I got backstage on a lot of things, but that particular thing, the Rockettes were all like 6 foot tall with 4 inches heels on top of that, and they had so I walked into the bar at Lincoln Center and they were taking a break or something. And like I'm the shortest
Right.
person
How
in the
tall
group.
are you?
I'm like 5'10", 5'11".
Okay. Okay. So they're like they're
Yeah.
they're on
And
up
they had
there
on
a
these,
little bit.
I think it's called brocade. It was like studded with beads. It was like these like the Spanish Armada boats should have had on. They were such stout, hard costumes that
Oh
made
wow.
them all shape exactly the same. And
Hmm.
they had tights on. They had top hats made out of the same
Um,
material, which they kind of had off. And so I'm walking around like, oh, like a 3-year-old. You know, I didn't know there was this much fake womanhood in the world, or sort of perfected womanhood in the world, which is really weird.
yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
so that's what my $2,400 went towards, things like that you couldn't do in Potter, Nebraska.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's awesome. See, like that makes so much sense. Will talked about in the second of his episodes how he took out a little bit of debt so that he could spend 2.5 months in Russia
There
on
you
like
go.
a study abroad experience that like he just knew he wanted to do that. And so he did take a little bit of loan to make that happen for himself and, just work it out. And it
Every
seems like you just know that like I want to live this. So you
everything
make it
every time
happen.
you do something like that, some kind of doors open away from the room you're in, you know?
Yeah.
You have to decide, well, do I go through that door or do I, you know,
Oh,
and people don't perceive the opportunities in life like that, but they're there every day. And everything you do puts you on a different vector. So if you walk away from one thing you're doing, you're not going to probably not going to come back there. And if you do come back there later in life, it's going to be with a totally different attitude and desire about it. You know, so it's like um, the willingness to walk through the door is the thing. And as you get older, you get smarter about. I don't want to do that. You know, I do want to do that, or I don't know anything about this, but wow, that looks great. You know, and that
yeah.
sort of. And so, you know, and I don't know if everybody gets the opportunities that I got, but there was always an opportunity, always a way to do something different to get out of whatever rut you felt you were in. So,
I mean, like you said, if it didn't feel good to me, I didn't spend very much time doing it.
mm,
I did what I
mhm,
had to do to
mm,
do what I got to do, but at the same time, I gravitate more
mhm,
and more towards what feels good to me personally. And I think that's what you're talking about with like, those are the doors you walk through.
mhm,
This feels good to me. So I'm going to
mhm,
head towards it. And that's like away from what doesn't feel quite as good. And
mhm,
when you're willing to do that, life just gets better and better and better and better. Like the rooms you're walking into, if you know like what you're talking about, like how to pick which doors to walk through, how to
mhm,
recognize the ones that are like, it's like glowing on the other side. How could I not walk through the door? Like, yeah, walk through it and watch your whole life change. You use the word vector. I'm gonna have to Google that to get me a good understanding of what does that mean.
if something's going in a circle and it releases, like it's going in a circle and it releases here, it'll go that way. If it
Oh,
releases right up here, it'll go that way.
oh,
So the vector
it like
is
shoots you off.
yeah, and it
Ah,
goes as
like a
though you
trajectory.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
I call it a timeline. Like when you will make a change like that, like you're basically accessing a new timeline.
yeah.
You do end up going in a completely different direction. And yeah, you were on the circle before, but then it's a whole new reality, a whole new level of reality that opens up. That's
What some people
possible.
don't understand is that every one of those experiences is your resume,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and you understand what it taught you and, maybe it's skills, but maybe it's also experience or understanding of other people or, you know, there's a lot of stuff in there. And so I have a law degree, which I have never used, but it's a big part of my resume. You know, people assume I always described it as like the USDA stamp on a chunk of meat. You know, inspected. He's been inspected. You can eat that.
Basically, that's basically what it is.
That's sort
Yeah.
of what my law
You've
degree
been
has been. But
inspected.
I've gotten jobs that had nothing to do with law, but I had a law degree. You know, it's like,
And they like that.
well, yeah, I guess you
Fancy.
could.
Sure. I know. I mean, that's kind of really all college is, as
Yeah.
far as what I can tell, because I also did not know what I wanted to do. And I mean, I have economics degrees and I've never been an economist. I've never had a job where somebody paid me to think like that. But that was what my training was in because I was like, oh, that's general enough that I could take that and kind of go in lots of different directions when one of them is shiny and glowing and I actually want to head in that direction. So,
Mhm.
yeah, I think it's really about proving that you have the stick with itness. And there's a lot of ways to prove that.
Mhm.
You don't have to get a
Mhm.
college degree to prove that you can do hard long term things, you know.
Plus, college has lots of doors. I mean, you meet
True,
professors that lead
true.
you other ways or get you interested in other things, or you meet
That's
friends,
a fact.
you know? It's just a way to get out of to move on from where you were, I think.
College has a lot of doors. That's very wise. Yeah, good way to get out of where you were. Um, yeah, I also use college for that same. kind of benefit. So, okay, so yeah, we've talked a little bit about your law degree, and we may come back to that time. I'm sure there's other stuff that we could learn from that time. But yeah, you graduated from high school in, was it Potter, Nebraska?
In Nebraska in
Potter,
1969
1969. And then you went
to the University of Nebraska in Lincoln.
and majored in what?
Well, originally, I don't think I had a major, but it was going to be liberal arts. But there was a language requirement at the time. Now I speak other languages, but I talk about a momentous decision that got made for the wrong reasons. I was really interested in political science and things of that nature, but there was a language requirement. And I have a German last name, so I thought, oh, I'll take German. And I walked into class, and there were like 30 kids, and the professor says, "Guten Tag," and all everybody in the class says, "Guten Tag," Herr Professor. They'd all had 3 or 4 or 5 years. This is the beginning German class, and they all had a long history in German. And he gave us a quiz that day, and I got an F, which was the first F I'd ever received in my life because I didn't know a word. I knew nothing. And so I spent the semester catching up, and eventually I got an A on the final, and that professor gave me a C. I mean, when you start thinking about, wow, that's kind of a dirty thing to do, wasn't it? I mean, I understand how he scheduled the grades and stuff like that, but I learned everything that there was to learn, and I still got a C, which is the only C I ever got in all my.
Hmm. You
And about
stuck with the
halfway through the
class
semester, it
though.
was clear to me I was stupid, and so I I got out of arts and sciences and went to business school where there was no language degree, and I managed to kind of carve a way through business school too. But I really wanted to be. I would have been more interested in political science and stuff like that. And I had political science professors that kept trying to get me to transfer back because they thought, oh, you like this stuff, but I'd moved on. So I was kind of pushed through a door, through a door into another thing that, but I made the best of it, I think. So,
So, one, you completed the class and got an
mhm,
A on the final. That's
mhm.
like amazing that you didn't just drop the class when you saw like the mountain ahead
Didn't
of
drop
you.
classes then. People didn't drop classes like that. That was a
Oh,
pretty rare thing to have somebody drop a class.
that's
So this was
like,
1970.
oh man, no, you just throw that hot
Oh
potato
yeah.
right on the
Oh
ground. You
yeah.
just don't even worry about it. You
It's
got a
like
grace
a
period.
pen that I don't want this.
Yeah,
No, that's
there's like
part
a
of.
trial period
Yeah,
today. Like you get
that
to
was not the
decide.
case. No, that was not the case. People
I
did
think
not drop
that
classes.
it should be, this is so funny. Like, I think it should be a lot more like it was back then because that's the other thing that I got in college was I climbed a lot of mountains. I did a lot of things that were way up there and I freaking climbed my ass up there. And
Mhm.
so the confidence that you get when
Mhm.
you start at an F and you get to an A, I mean that's the real what you're getting your money's worth out of college in my opinion, whether you get the C or not.
Yeah, but I was 18, I didn't know the thought was, I guess I don't know, I can't learn languages. I mean,
Oh,
all this about at the time I transferred out of that
yeah.
school, it was like halfway through the semester, so the next semester, I started something different, and I managed, like I said, I managed to through independent study and other things, find, some pathways through business school that interested me. Business school was the easiest thing I'd ever seen in my life. I had an accounting course at one point, and I think it was second level accounting course. And the professor asked me to come by one day, and he says, "Why aren't you going to the labs?" And I said, "There's labs." I didn't know there were labs. He said, "Well, you're getting all A's, but there's a lab." And I go, "Okay." So I got to go. And he goes, "You know what? You don't have to go to the lab." I mean, it just was very natural for me. Not that it interested me. I wasn't
Yeah.
interested in accounting. I've had to use accounting many times in my life. So, I mean, it was a good thing. Um, I described myself on a project I was on in Senegal as the philosopher accountant for the project. I had to think about the directions, but I also had to keep track of all that stuff too.
Yeah.
So anyway, I abandoned that and went to business school, and I took a lot of, I think it was called urban economics at the time. Why are poor people's houses bulldozed to make the freeway? Why did the bus lines run this way instead of that way?
And what did you learn?
Well,
Why
I
did
learned
why
that
did they do that?
because people were powerless. If you were powerless or racially not white, and and they wanted to run a freeway, well,
Well,
where's it going to go?
like,
And
yeah.
it was true in little Lincoln, Nebraska. 120,000 or 30,000 people at the time.
Good
There
for
was an
them.
African American section of town, and they wanted to run a freeway right into the middle of it, and it didn't happen just because of finances, but that's where they were going to do it. They were just going to bulldoze all those people out of there, and so they could put a big, and that's happened time and again in this country. That happens all the time. So things have improved a little bit there. People make noise now about stuff like that. And I took a lot of labor classes. I took a couple of business law classes, which I think helped me do well on the LSAT. I just tried to find the social things that interested me in law school. Econ was okay. I mean, I did well in it. It was pretty interesting. It wasn't as interesting as political science or anything to me anyway. That for sure.
Yeah. No,
But
I get that.
yeah.
Huh. Did you have much of a political science background before college? Like,
Well,
how'd you
my
get there
parents
from
my
rural
parents
Nebraska?
were Democrats in a Republican wasteland. I mean, they were.
Ah,
I mean, at the time, Nebraska was way more purple than it is now, but it was pretty Republican. And um, and so we were Kennedy. We liked Kennedy instead of Nixon and all that kind of stuff. And so there was all that kind of thing going on, even through grade school. Out on the playground, it's like Nixon's no good. Yes, he is. No, he's not. Yes, he is. I mean, no, didn't know why Nixon or Kennedy was no good, but it was like, you know, you were on a team, that kind of thing.
sure.
Um,
You had your side.
the other thing was the Vietnam War was going on. Um, Nebraska was pretty anemic about the response. I mean, somebody threw a Molotov cocktail in the student union and it burned up a chair. And I've always joked that it must have been one of those little bottles, from airlines full of gasoline because it burned up a chair. It didn't burn up the student union. And down in Lawrence, they were blowing up buildings, and Madison, they were blowing up buildings. People were dying, all that kind of stuff. And I remember my the one poli sci professor that I really enjoyed. He said he went to one of the protests, and he said there were like 7 leaders of the protests in Lincoln, and he said they were all kind of chubby and they all acted like they were at a party. And he said the revolutionaries that I've seen elsewhere were thin, you know, emaciated, serious, and looked like they were ready to die for whatever it was that they were, you know. He said, I don't think this is I don't think this is a real, revolution at all. This is not going to happen. And I remember University of Nebraska was also a big football team, and they won the national championship two years in a row. And Nixon, in trying to prop up his image, decided he'd come out and give the trophy or whatever it was, national champion trophy, to Lincoln. By then, my hair was, it was growing, and talk about on a cusp. So he was coming, and we were going to protest, but he's the president of the United States. So I remember putting on a shirt and tie to
To go protest him.
go protest this guy who was like blowing up half the world.
We want to
It's
be
like, but he's
respectful.
our president.
Oh my gosh. You're really finding that middle line, aren't you? That's so funny. Oh, good
Anyway,
time. Yeah.
Nebraska was pretty anemic. They did have a strike.
What do you mean by that? Like just
It
like
was not.
wanted to stay out of it, or like what does that mean?
It's not our business. You're just troublemakers want to cause problems about the war in Vietnam, but and even my parents, my it's like, well, Vietnam, we have to halt communism, somehow. And 3 years later, they would have paid our bus fare to Canada. I mean, there was a switch during that war period. And I think the hippies caused that switch, and the yippies and everybody else. But it was sort of like, why is everybody dying over there again? It's so far away. The Vietnamese didn't even seem that friendly with China. Then you start reading about Ho Chi Minh lived in this country, and Ho Chi Minh tried to, we were basically propping up the French colonialists. That's why we even waded into that thing, and it just quit making sense. And what we have done about it as a society, we hide it. We don't draft people to go there, but we have troops everywhere in the world. Plus, we can bomb anywhere in the world remotely with bombers and drones and everything else. I mean, it's just sort of like all the suffering on our end has been taken off the table. And having said that, it's not like we're the evilest people in the world either. I mean, to some, yeah, it's really bad, but to a lot of others, it's like, God, I'm glad they're there. I mean, if I think about Putin running the world, or even China versus us, it's like sort of, well, we're moderately the better bet. I'm a little bit more ashamed of the use of raw power, or so ashamed that we hide it. I don't, I don't know if that's,
At
I
least
don't know
we
if
have
that's
the shame to hide it. That's
I,
a sales pitch for the US if I've ever heard one. Holy crap. That's really funny. You're really good at the one-liners. Yeah. Yeah, like what I want to know, and this is probably like, not exactly grounded in reality, but like why does anybody have to rule the world? Why is that a foregone conclusion that we need somebody sitting in that friggin' seat?
that's what history is, right? It's like,
It
who's ruling now.
How many lives did that method cost us is
Hmm.
what I want to know. And why do we need somebody to tell us what to do? This world ruler. Like everybody leave everybody else alone. Stop stealing each other's resources. Just, like why?
Do you remember the Maya Lin Vietnam Memorial in DC on the,
I've
you
never
know,
actually been to DC. I would love to go someday.
well, every war memorial ever was some, Caesar on a horse on a triumphal arch sort of thing. And that one, it's set in the ground, and it's a pathway down like this, and there's a black wall here, and it's right angle, and a black wall there, and it's just the names of all the Americans who died, and people come there and cry. It's like, and that was so controversial to have a non-triumphant war memorial. It was like
Mm.
she was vilified. They actually then people raised money for an addition, which is some grunts, walking. It was sort of it was realistic, but it was a more traditional celebration of soldiers sort of thing. And that's, if you want a metaphor for how how the perception of war changed by the hippies and the yippies and that's a good one, because it's suddenly it was, this was so bad, as opposed to, we kicked their butt.
It
you know.
it doesn't make sense. It's
Mhm.
just needlessly violent, often. And it doesn't make sense from a global tribe kind of perspective. Like the more you can see into the rest of the world, they are just like us. They just want to have a good life on this planet.
Mhm.
You know, like we're just eating food. We're just here trying to have a good life. And yeah, there's a lot going on out there fighting amongst ourselves. And there's a long ways to go from what I'm describing as far as like, why can't there just be a peaceful coexistence? You know,
Yeah.
where does this vying for power, feeling like you don't have enough, where does that come from? And yeah, if anything, like you're saying, like the hippies, I mean, for as chubby and meandering as they were, by golly, like they made a point.
Mhm.
And I think they did call people's attention to it. And it didn't change everything, but does anything ever change everything? You know, like
Well,
it's
I mean,
only
it
one step
changed
at a
our
time.
parents. I mean, our parents, whether you liked it or not, you had a different thought in your head after the Vietnam War. I mean, just the thought that, well, we're always right, or even if we're not right, we have to be supportive of what it is. That's gone, I think.
Kind of like blind followership. Like,
Yeah.
no, we're gonna
Then that draws into question the whole idea of a state anyway, you know. Why is there a United States of America? I mean, sometimes it doesn't seem so cohesive. So
we could go in.
anyway, so I was at the University of Nebraska.
I wanted to ask though, like, were you ever close to being drafted? Did that go on? Like when you
I got a draft number. It was 168, which was right on the borderline. I had a draft deferment because I was in college. Talk about racial discrimination and class discrimination because I was at university. I mean, the, this the this United States government thought that it was very important to keep me reading Kurt Vonnegut, you know, instead of going to war. You know, I got to keep him in school. Or, you know, it had it was a racist draft deferment basically, or classist. You know, I
wow.
mean, so all the white kids were doing that. I mean, a lot of white kids went to Vietnam too, or but you know, when they first announced the draft numbers, I mean, people who I knew who had low numbers started looking at National Guard and looking at, you know, any shelter in a storm because they didn't particularly want to go. And there were people who did want to go too. I don't, you know, deny that, but
When you say you got a draft number and it was borderline, like
there was a lottery. There was a lottery from 1 to 365, and if you were number one, you were going. I mean, that's barring, you know, some physical ailment or, you know, something like that. You were first up, and so then they would go. They would keep drawing up the numbers as they went, and my number was right at the edge where I could go or I might not go, but I had my draft deferment as long as I stayed in school and, you know, wasn't flunking out, that sort of thing. There was a university in western Nebraska called Hiram Scott College, which was considered a draft deferment school, and it was set up for rich kids who'd flunked out of everywhere else could go there and pay a very high tuition.
so you bought a draft deferment.
Yeah, you bought your
Just buy
education,
one of those.
but those guys couldn't even. They still dropped out or flunked out. I mean, those guys were not. They couldn't behave themselves. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's not always a blessing to be born into
No,
riches, you know. But that's beside the point. So yeah, okay, wow. Like I mean, it doesn't sound like you ever were at risk of dropping out.
no, I no.
I mean, but it sounds like that would have been a real good incentive to stick with it if there ever was a doubt in your mind that like,
It would have probably, but I didn't.
yeah, you were good. So you came to the end of your college
Mhm.
with your business degree and went straight to law school. How did you come to the decision that out of everything in the world that you could be doing, law school is the right next step? What was that
I,
like?
I said to my mom, what should I do? And she said, well, why don't you go to law school? So I said, okay. So I took the LSAT and I did really well on it. And on the LSAT at the time, there was a little box you could check if you wanted your scores to sent to schools that were interested in certain demographics. Well, I'm white as can be, but I was also a farm kid from Western Nebraska, and um, they sent my LSATs to Columbia, which I hadn't even considered. And Columbia said, "Well, we'll give you a full ride." And I go, "Well, that's a that's a door."
That's the door. Yeah, that's a glowing door. Did New York sweeten the deal that like you would get to do
Oh
law
yeah,
school
This
in New
is like
York City?
wanting to be more worldly. This was like,
Yeah,
oh, yeah,
yeah. And they're gonna pay for it.
yeah, that's right. So that was
All
great.
because of your score on the test? That's how they found you?
Because I was a kid from Western Nebraska, my score.
And did
I
you study for the LSAT or you just took it?
no, I didn't study for that. But what was I going to say? Every kid there had a really high score, and they probably could have gotten all the students they needed within 8 or 10 blocks of Columbia. I mean, so it was diversity. I mean, believe it or not,
You,
I am a
you were the diverse one. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. Probably not for the last time in your life, right?
I don't know.
Well, for sure, your time in Africa, I had to think you were probably part of the minority
Oh, always. Yeah.
during that time. So, I mean, you have some experience with being in the shoes of the minority, which I got to think is a life experience that supports your political science interest.
It's true. On the other hand, in Africa, you were generally a privileged minority. I
Oh,
mean, I
that's
was
a weird
$100
one.
a month, which was, a yearly income for anybody, an African, where I lived. And I lived in Mali, the Gambia, Sierra Leone, and Senegal. And all four of those at the time, if you looked at the 180 United Nations and the well-being, those were like in the bottom 10. I mean, they were all, and I thought people were fine there. They were doing fine. It was like they'd figured out how to be a poor villager and have a life and all that kind of stuff. And so I kind of would swoop in and I'd have resources and stuff like that. But I really enjoyed it and made a lot of friends, and it was just a good thing.
Mm. Yeah, we're going to talk a lot about those years, no doubt.
Mhm.
That's so cool that your mom was like, "Why don't you go to law school?" I'm like,
Okay.
okay, okay.
Why don't you drop out of
I wonder why
law
she said,
school? Okay.
right, right. Why don't you jump off this bridge? What? I wonder why she said law school of all things. Like if that was something
Oh,
that
would the mother say law school? I mean,
my dad said pharmacist. He
yeah,
was like, if you want to be real set, you should go to pharmacy school.
yeah.
That was his recommendation. I did not go to pharmacy school. Spoiler, but
Well, and law could have been a threshold to the political science sort of stuff that I was interested into, and I I got a lot of great stuff out of law school,
yeah,
but a job in a firm for the rest of my life wasn't one of those.
yeah,
Or, hanging out a shingle and doing,
your own thing.
yeah,
Decided that wasn't something
yeah,
that you needed.
that interested me.
Yeah.
And also I was attracted to criminal defense, and I was attracted to trial law, and it just innervated. It just made me so nervous. The whole um, the whole solving problems by combat kind of thing, which is what a trial was just like, it was repulsive to me. I didn't like it. I worked as a public defender in Colorado Springs. I'll be writing about that pretty shortly.
Cool.
I've actually written it. I haven't published it yet, but I mean, it was a funny, strange thing to do.
Why?
And
Why so?
I enjoyed that part of it, but I didn't want to do it forever.
How long did you do it?
Well, I was just out in Colorado Springs one summer it was my second summer in law school, and it was experientially was an amazing summer. You know, I was doing all kinds of stuff, but I started to question. You know, we had clients that even if we got them to walk, you know, we got them out, they would be in jail a day and a half later for doing the same crime. So you're defending the system. You know, the system has to be just, but you're also at times helping people who are doing repulsive things get back out there. You know,
Yeah.
so it
Yeah.
was, you know, you start. I lost some empathy, I think, not for everybody, but there were a few disappointing. We had a motorcycle gang that were almost on retainer. You know, they would you'd see them all the time, and this is in that story. But there were four guys and a woman, and the woman had a great big tattoos on her butt cheeks, and I knew that because she cut big holes in her jeans.
Good. So you could see them for
So
yourself.
and we
Yeah.
always met them not in our office, but in the Japanese bar next door for some reason. So we'd go over to the Japanese bar,
Uh-huh.
and you know, like Larry Posner was the attorney. Larry was this little skinny Jewish guy. And one day he gets this call and he says, "You've got what? You what? Don't you hurt him? Don't you hurt him?" They had a witness in one of their cases tied up in the garage, and they were calling their lawyers to find out what what they could do about it. Well, don't kill him, don't, you know. And so Larry jumps in the car and goes off.
Oh my
So
gosh.
Larry came to my attention 25 years later, 30 years later, when Kobe Bryant, remember the basketball player, was arrested for rape of a hotel maid, like in Vail or something like that. And so it became a big cause celeb. You know, it was like it was like OJ. It was almost that big a OJ thing.
Yeah.
And Larry Posner was the head of the uh, the Criminal Defenders Association in Colorado. And so suddenly he's in my television screen all the time. And he got from the skinny buck-toothed guy to like this sleek-haired, suave. I mean, the same guy, but he was like somebody had remade his look.
New
But he
era
was
2.0.
there were 7 lawyers there, and they all were smart in their own way and interesting in their own way. The head of the Colorado Public Defenders, what was his name? Frank. Anyway, he had started NORML, National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. He was he was like this big head and had risen to the top of that particular Colorado Public Defender's office, long hair. And I don't know, there's just a bunch of different attorneys, all with their different styles, and it was fun to watch, learn.
Place with many doors.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool that you got to do that and that you got to see once again into a different culture. You know,
Oh
I
yeah.
would love to talk to somebody who has practiced law for a really long time and get to understand, right, what motivates somebody to do what you do. Because whether you're on the prosecutor side or the defense side, like, I don't, yeah, I don't get it. I
Well,
can, yeah.
there's some real enmity between public defenders and prosecutors, and it's all pretty civil in court, but um, it's clear both sides will cheat on the other side if they get the chance, you know.
Mm,
Um,
people, people.
Colorado Springs has Cheyenne Mountain. It's got a Army base. It's got the Air Force Academy. It's like a big collection of 18-year-old men who are at that time, away from home for the first time. And so crime rates up, just young men doing stupid young men things, and drugs. And so a lot of our clientele were, if they weren't motorcycle gangs, they were soldiers, It's just, yeah, it's an underbelly that you don't think about, but it was there definitely. Now
Mm.
Colorado Springs is like the right wing Christian capital of the world, but that all that
Everything can
stuff's still there.
everything can transform and be something completely different given long enough. Oh, wow. So, okay, so that was in the middle. That was one of your summers. Did you do any other internships? Did you like go into any other law
Well,
practices?
in college, every summer after my first year in college, I worked for the Burlington Northern Railroad
Doing what?
as a brakeman on the
What's
what's
that?
called the Extra Board. There's a Substack on that, which I
Okay.
think is a pretty good read, and
Okay.
I think it's called Riding the Rails or something like that. And
Sweet.
that's a whole other culture of everything from bigamists, guys who have wives on each end of the, you know, to just it's a dangerous job. It was a
I'll read
strange.
the thing. We'll link
Yeah,
it.
yeah, you'll
We'll
enjoy
link
that.
it too. Okay.
Yeah, it's called Riding the Rails, I think. Yeah, on Substack.
Well, and that's maybe a good point to mention Dan's Substack. So I'll put the link to the Substack overall, and then we'll link a couple of the specific articles if people want recommendations for kind of where to start.
Mhm.
I'm also on the email list. So every time he publishes one, I see it come through my email, and some of his titles will definitely cause you to click on them and want to see what is this all about exactly. And then oh man, I feel like it's an emotional roller coaster in the best possible way. It's so engaging, so entertaining to read, and yet the perspective will really get you to think about some things that maybe you haven't thought about in a while or ever, or from this angle. I think Dan has succeeded as much as most people can at being worldly and seeing like a good round perspective of how lots of different people live. And so there's a lot of commentary on like kind of global level perspective of kind of how the overall human population is evolving at this time and like what does the next 100 years look like under the threat of global warming and the one that I read this morning, but also just humans and where we've come from and where we're going. And fascinating, fascinating, a little horrifying just based on it's a very
But
clear sighted view.
as I
You don't.
say, the fact that I wrote it meant I got through it.
Well, there you go. That's beautiful. Yeah, absolutely. So, highly recommend if you're enjoying Dan's stories. He has a whole Substack. Would you say like you got 3 different books that you're writing kind of
Yeah,
simultaneously?
I just add a chapter every week or two on each one of them.
Yeah, just kind of one story at a time, whatever you're inspired by at the time. I love that. So yeah, we'll link some stuff if anybody wants to check out the Substack or subscribe and follow along with your publishing your stories there.
Not
You're
free.
what's
It's
that?
free. It's free.
Yeah,
So
yeah, and very entertaining. So highly recommend. Do you think are you aiming for a book? Like you want to get to the point where you have a whole book that you can publish as a book?
I talked to a couple of authors, published authors specifically about that, and my wife is a published author, and she's had a how-to book that's done extremely well for a long time, still in print and all that. But I guess my stuff's kind of more general interest, and it's hard. I mean, I would hate to be trying to make a living publishing books because the economics are just terrible. It's
Yeah,
a you're giving yourself strokes, to get a book out there with that's really what it's all about. It's sort of now I'll be remembered forever until it gets remaindered. That
yikes, yeah,
that's just not the case. So I think of it as downloading the stuff that's in my head, and that's my so that other people can read it, and that's good enough for me. I'm
yeah.
not you know
Taking it step by step.
yeah.
And yeah, someday if it adds up into a book, great. And if it doesn't, sounds like you're having fun along the way. And people are enjoying it along the way. I see the comments on your articles that people are engaging with it and reading it and liking it. So
Mhm.
yeah, that's
Well,
beautiful.
I would say so the Substack, I mean, I used to just shoot those onto Facebook, and I get a lot of comments. You get more on Facebook just because it's easier for people to
Mm-hmm.
but, the readership is a lot higher on Substack. I mean, there's, a lot more people are reading these things. So there's like 4,000 people have read some of these things, which I
Your
just never,
Substack?
yeah,
Oh
that's
wow.
they're not subscribed to it, but
Uh-huh.
it's given to other people. I mean,
Yeah.
it's getting read. It's being more read on Substack than it was on Facebook. So
Wow.
it's it.
Cool.
Yeah, I didn't know. I just thought I figured Facebook is just ephemeral. It kind of, I mean, it's there, but it kind of goes on down and nobody ever sees it again. But Substack allows people to reread something or try something else, that sort of thing.
Yeah. One other thing I'll say, as far as being subscribed to it, I get an email like every time you publish
Put,
something, and then it's in my inbox, kind of
yeah,
like sitting there waiting for me to get to it. So I remember,
yeah,
maybe I'm not exactly in the mood to read it right this minute, but I'm going to come back to it. Versus on
yeah,
Facebook, you just scroll by and then you never
yeah.
see it again.
Again, it's
So
gone.
yeah, I could see that. I've really enjoyed, like I said, the title of the one that you put out yesterday. We'll link that one in the description. It got me. I clicked, and I was glad I did. So so yeah, good job on that.
Why hasn't that been written before?
Right? Well,
It seems
like you said, the
like
guy, how do you say his name? The scientist that you,
Vaclav Smil.
Vaclav Smil.
Yeah, the greatest name,
I do love that. Yeah.
greatest scientist name ever.
I was like,
Yeah.
I've never heard either one of those words. I have no idea how to pronounce it, but okay. Vaclav Smil. Yeah, he definitely sounds like a scientist. Yeah,
He's really good. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
good deal. So I mean, sounds like he's writing a lot about it.
He's
Like
written 40 books.
40?
And he'll write a book like it'll be entitled Risk or Growth. And then he'll start putting numbers to it. And he's a real, rationally puts numbers to things.
Yeah.
And one of the ways he's really changed my thinking. I mean, I've been involved in green energy for a long time, and it's like we just get rid of the fossil fuels and just went all green energy, we could solve this quickly. And he points out, how much green energy or how much fossil fuel we use for this, the whole, I mean, it's so much greater than you could ever think. There's got to be a long transition from one to the other, and simultaneously talks about, nuclear fission. He says, love it or leave it. It's out there. If you want to transition away from fossil fuels, it's one of the possibilities. And he's a little critical of hydrogen, but in the sense that you bet we have to figure this out. It's like the reason planes and trucks use gasoline and diesel fuel is because it's an airplane fuel, and kerosene is that there's a real high energetics. There's so much energy in a small quantity that you can move heavy things through the air, and there's really batteries aren't going to do that. You're not going to, at least at this point, you're not going to have a lot of air transport or a lot of any kind of transport that's not based on those highly compressed energetics. I mean, just thinking about it's a grounding. It's a reality of what you want to happen and how you get there. At least you should know where we are when you start. And
Yeah.
so he gets criticized from both sides. He gets criticized from the fossil fuel industry and gets criticized from the green industry.
Like you were saying in your article from yesterday, the sex one, as I've come to start calling it, like the oh, lost my train of thought. The sex one, it got me. What was it going to be?
Well, the fact that there are so many people in the world, and there's going to be more, and a huge majority of them do not have our lifestyle. We use about 150 times the energy that an Ethiopian uses, and
Right.
so and a lot of ours is used for plastic packaging and stuff like that. And so it's like we really need to degrowth some of these sort of wasteful, things. Just quit
Yes.
doing a lot of it, and we need to grow some of those poor economies,
Yeah.
you know, they need a better chance, a better lifestyle.
That's
And
what I was going to say, was like anybody who is coming out and advocating for degrowth, it's just not popular because like what you're saying is that there should be less people on the planet. There should be less procreation than
and
there is.
which ones?
Which ones?
The
And
one that
now
uses too much or the one that doesn't have enough, you know? And
I,
it's always been the one that doesn't have enough is the one that's going to be made to pay, you know?
and in my opinion, I'm just one person sharing my perspective. Like, we can't keep doing it that way. And we can't keep thinking of like the only measure of success is how much did you grow? Like, we need to redefine success so that it's way bigger than that, so that we can be successful and not grow at the same time. Because the hyperfixation on growth, we're like combusting. I don't think that's the right word that I'm looking for, but like eating the planet. Basically, we're eating our own ecosystem and kind of harvesting power from each other to do it. And like that's just not sustainable, you know? Like,
There was a New York Times story 4 or 5 days ago about um, the need for more water, and Western Kansas had four different situations, and two of them were in Western Kansas, and one was about a water board in Western Kansas, and everybody on it is a large landowner. Well, that's the 1% of Western Kansas, right? And the argument is, well, we have the land, so we really need to be the ones making all the decisions. So if we use all the water in you know, this little tiny town, and all the people have to leave, they don't have a say in that. You know, it's sort of like people with net worths of $15 million, because they have a net worth of $15 million, they should have to say on whether this little town can exist or not, because they need the money, the water for their crops, you know, and their crops are to make ethanol. You know, it's sort of like the decision making has been concentrated to the wealthy, and you know, that flies in the face of a democratic ideal. It does. It just does.
yeah, yeah, like you're saying, I mean, it's a long game solution that we need here. It's a long transition off of where we are right now to something that looks very different from this. I believe it's possible. And I think conversations like this one are honestly how we get there. As far as looking at like what even is it that's going on right now and what could it be? What could be different? And greater equality, I think, is basically what we're talking about here, as far as like more people getting to make empowered decisions about what their life is, you know, and hopefully less hoarding of resources in the process of that, you know. But those are big asks. Those are huge for people who have to talk about like, why don't you give some of that up? You know, countries that are growing, why don't you stop growing? You have enough. Why don't you give some to people who don't have as much? And then, yeah, that's a hard sell. Degrowth is a hard sell to people who have, and it is the option that makes sense. You know, nobody says that the global population has to go up and up and up and up and up forever. Like, why is that a foregone conclusion? You know?
I thought one of the interesting things that Smil said was the in the 1960s, America in the West was using basically per capita about half of the energy that we use now, and it was very comfortable. So what we've added is your TV comes on immediately, and you plastic packaging, and you can fly to Denmark at a I mean, we've added all these things that didn't necessarily, that weren't, they were just wants, they weren't needs, you know, they were, and needs were being met, and people were comfortable and happy, and it's like we're based on creating more wants, you know. It's just, so the degrowth, there's plenty of room just in our wastefulness, you know. There's room for a lot of more people.
Yeah. Well,
Well,
one example of that, like
huh?
a very practical example of what you're talking about, I think. One thing that I personally did for this reason, I switched off of body wash, which comes in a plastic bottle that you have to throw away every 2 weeks or whatever, to bar soap. And so there's just a little cardboard box that I throw away, or like one little plastic cellophane, not a hard, big plastic bottle. Same thing with my laundry soap, same thing with my dishwasher soap. Like the packaging that you are individually consuming is up to you. Do you buy the body wash and keep doing that? Or do you buy the bar of soap because it is personally decreasing your footprint? And like degrowth happens on an individual basis. I think, like as a population, we're never going to do that. It's too hard of a sell. It's like too steep of a mountain to climb. But individually, we can make those decisions.
In the 70s, we said shower with a friend. So that was
Dude, great. That sounds awful. Hippies, you gotta love hippies. They got the best ideas. But like that's what I'm talking about. Is like, you can be mindful. Okay, this might be TMI or gross, but like I don't flush my toilet every time I pee in it. I don't do that. I have to clean my toilet a lot more often. But I personally feel like, why am I spending 2-3 gallons of water because I went tinkle? Like, I'm not willing to use those resources, not because water is expensive, because it's not, it's stupid cheap. I feel like if we had to pay more for it, we would be a lot more conservative with it, but that's a whole nother subject. But like, I don't want to use it. I could be, but I don't want to, because I want the water to stay there, as long as it can. I don't need to flush my toilet at home every single time I use it. I forget sometimes though, and then I don't flush public toilets. Try to remember. I try to remember. Get back in the habit when I need to. But yeah, these little choices, you can enact that anytime.
I was reading the other day that the savings because of the growth of electric bicycles, not like they're used in the US, which are old people, just exercising, but bicycles and tricycles has far exceeded, there's like 210 million of them out there now. It's far exceeded electric cars. It's reduced the consumption of gasoline by 1% nationwide, just in the last 2 or 3 years. It's sort of like, and that has to do with Americans feel like they need to drive a car around when they go to the grocery store. They're driving 4,000 pounds of metal to haul their scrawny asses to the grocery store.
Bring home their gallon of milk. Yeah.
I'll get a scrawny vehicle and haul my scrawny ass to the, and and so a battery goes way farther. It's much cheaper vehicle to build, all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And so there's some mind changes that have to take place, even if you move to electric vehicles. I mean, what we do in this country is it's got 900 horsepower now. We can make them go faster. We can make them larger. It's sort of like the discovery of an economy is an excuse to further growth and to more, surround ourselves with luxury. And it's like
luxury.
That's going to end, it's just got to end at some point. And those people who figure that out early and figure out how to make it still enjoyable, those are the people we need. We don't need people figuring out how to, suck up the economy that was just made into more consumption.
Yeah. Learning.
I think this little podcast, I don't know. It seems pretty disjointed. I don't know.
Oh man, I don't think so. I think we're going to watch it back. And I think it makes, I've been tracking exactly how we got here. If you back it up and start at the beginning. I think there's always an arc of evolution that's going on. And that's what you keep saying with like, I was born on a cusp and here's another cusp and there's another cusp. And there's always the next wave of evolution. And how does that wave build up and then wash over and become real? people sharing ideas, people talking about, like, I don't think that thing makes sense anymore.
Mhm.
Because what about this, this, and this? You know? And so, yeah, I see we held up a lot of different things on this podcast, and we shared a lot of different ideas. There's a whole buffet of ideas in this episode, but all things that will hopefully help people to think about, how does this work in the microcosm of your own personal life? Are you growing just to grow? Which is basically AKA keeping up with the Joneses. Are you keeping up with the Joneses, or are you building a life that is enjoyable from the inside out? Those are two very different things. Are you consuming just to consume because everybody else is doing it? Or, do you have a purpose and an intention with what you spend your money on and your time? Like, money is one thing. Our time is the real commodity that I think, like, we could be a lot more intentional about what we're choosing to use our time on. Hopefully the people that spent their time with us on this episode feel like they got their values worth with some thought stirring conversations, which I definitely think we accomplished that today. So next time, if you will rejoin us for yet another episode. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, sweet.
Sure.
Next time we will absolutely pick it up with, how did the decision come about to join the Peace Corps? And I believe there was even some, where would you land and kind of which direction would you go in the Peace Corps that was influenced by your law degree. So we'll kind of start there as far as, how did you land in Africa?
Mhm.
And maybe next episode can be the Africa years, at least part one of that, because you were there for quite some time, right? 8 years, was that
Oh, yeah.
right?
Always in agriculture doing that
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah. Such a cool experience. I mean, isn't the Peace Corps like a 2-year
I
kind of?
was 2 years in Sierra Leone and then a third year in Mali, um, because I had participated in trainings that took place in villages in Sierra Leone, and Mali was interested in training their volunteers that way. So they created a position for me to be a 1-year volunteer, and that segued into directing their training as a paid position in
In
Mali. So,
Mali.
yeah.
So you
And then
stayed there
I
for,
was never a Peace Corps volunteer after that, but I did do several contracts with Peace Corps in the Gambia and Senegal and other places. So
and was it 8 years total in Africa?
under 8 years, yeah. Uh-huh.
Okay, okay. Yeah. So we're going to get to hear about that next time. I'm super excited to pick it up there next time we come back.
Okay.
For those who did like it, take a second and like the video, leave a comment down below. We'd love to hear your thoughts of what stood out from this hodgepodge episode that was so fun to get to make. Thank you so much, everyone,
Sure.
for joining us. Thank you, Dan, for being here. It's my pleasure to get to host this. Until next time, everybody take really good care of themselves, and we'll talk to you soon.
Hello out there, and welcome back. This is another episode of My Grocery Adventure, a podcast for people who want to make an impact in the world. There's a lot of different ways that we can do that. And today we are rejoined for his third episode by Dan Nagengast. Hello, Dan. Welcome back.
All right, it's good to be here.
Oh, always good to have you. We left off last time on Dan's last episode with the end of your law school experience. I was going to say your college years, but really that extended into you being in law school in New York City and all of the fun that went along with that. And as you came to the end, you shared last time that, like, you knew that you enjoyed law school, but that you did not want to be a lawyer. So we had already kind of found that clarity that you knew as you ended law school, it wasn't going to be getting a job as a lawyer. But how did you decide kind of where you went next? What were the other options that you were considering?
Well, from New York, I moved to Boston, which for New Yorkers was the only other conceivable place in the universe that one could ever live. We had people take us out to dinner to ask us how this was going to happen, and of course, it entails quitting your job and moving to Boston. I mean, it was that easy. And I struggled finding a job there for a while, but eventually started working at Tufts University And it was a legal job, and it was writing it was the UN survey of population related laws for 1976. It's one of these things that gets sent out all over the world, and people put them in their bookshelves behind them so that they look, and then they line up over the years, and so that's the backdrop for their Zooms, but it was, for their photographs, I guess, before. So I did that, and decided, boy, I need to change. And I was trying to think of, I mentioned before I wanted to be more worldly, and so I applied to Peace Corps, and the first thing they tried to convince me of was to go to U.S. Samoa, U.S. Guam, somewhere to write a constitution for them. And so I went through all the rigmarole of taking that, trying to get that position, and someone else took it before I ever got to. So I looked around for what else was available, and I'd grown up on a farm, and that was a good enough qualification for an agricultural job. And so I applied to go to Peace Corps Sierra Leone. And Peace Corps Sierra Leone, if you look at the big bulge out there into the Atlantic towards, or Sierra Leone, if you look at the bulge in the Atlantic towards South America, it's sort of on what would be, if you considered that to be a pregnant woman's belly, it would be on the belly button there of that pregnant woman.
Right.
And it's a lovely country, beautiful country, tropical, 120 inches of rainfall a year, blessed with lots of natural resources, which the British and the Americans and the Canadians and whoever else has been hauling out of there for centuries now. The capital is Freetown. It was established by the British, was a former British colony, and it was established as a place when they decided to start halting the slave trade. Freetown was established, and when British ships would capture slavers, they would take everyone to Freetown and set them free. And these were people from all across the west coast of Africa. And so it became a very kind of cosmopolitan place. It was used by the British as it was a good port. Freetown's a good port, so it was used during the Napoleonic Wars and all that kind of stuff. But it had a population in the city itself who became the Creoles, which is a Creole-speaking, English-speaking population. And it also became a place where when people, Canada or the U.S. would try to resettle American slaves, it would send them to Freetown. And Monrovia, Liberia became another city, which is the next country down the coast. And so there were, it just had this population of people who had been all over the world and came from all kinds of different cultures in West Africa. And that's where they were dropped off, and never to see their home country again unless they decided to travel. So that's where I went. And the project was not working in Freetown in that Creole culture, but it was working in the existing tribal cultures out in the country. So these were, the Mende and the Timne, and there were like 8 or 10 different tribes living out there, and pretty much undisturbed by the British. I had a guy from Sierra Leone tell me once that instead of the lion rampants you see on coats of arms, which they have in Sierra Leone, he said, really what we should have had was the mosquito, because Sierra Leone was known as the white man's graveyard. They would go there and die, for malaria. So that though there were British there, and they did a lot of stuff, and they built railroads to haul rutile out, and there were diamonds, and there was all this kind of stuff. A lot of the Brits died trying to do that. So as some countries go, it's relatively untouched, although, to say it was untouched is not true either.
Sure.
So I was trained in rice culture, learning how to build really the Chinese style rice swamps with a big bund and the water coming out and going into the patties and all that kind of stuff. Totally foreign to Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone has an African rice. It's called Oryza glaberrima. It's an upland rice. It's grown on the hillsides. It's got a dark red, almost wheat-like color to it, and where many of the nutrients in the rice are, and it was used. And when people cooked with it, they would put it in mortar and pestles and beat that the color, the outside skin, the outside part of it off, and feed that to the chickens. So it was like they didn't like the taste particularly of their own rice, and that's just a acculturated thing, over years. But in a rainforest country with not a lot of population demands, the upland rice was a type of agriculture that worked. It was slash and burn. So the way that would work is during the dry season, you would move your farm. So every year or every 2 years, people would move their farm, and they'd go to this tall rainforest, palm trees, big trees, old trees, all kinds of stuff. And they would chop all the trees down and take machetes and take all the low foliage down and and burn it. So they'd burn it all, scrape it. Then they would broadcast this rice, this Oryza glaberrima, out on it, kind of, scratch it in. They'd build a little hut and they'd spend their days during the rice growing season out there. And so people would get up and leave in the morning and they'd go out there. And this culture returned about, I think we calculated it was about 4 bushels of rice for every bushel of seed. So it quadrupled the seed. It's all done by hand with shovels, axes, hoes. It was harvested by hand with a little, like, not a pen knife, but like a paring knife. The men would do all the chopping and burning and stuff like that. The women would, a lot of the men and Clay watched the fields the rest of the year, and in the time there were men that would do some of that too, but there was a definite role for that. And the women would have their children out there and they would be harvesting rice with a baby on their back, and another one, at the hut with a 4-year-old or a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old watching the baby, that sort of thing. And, they were all within hearing distance and stuff like that. Then that would be harvested by hand. So rice is a really beautiful, by the way, it's a beautiful crop. And they would chop the heads off, which are big flowing kind of heads hanging like this and with about that much stem. And they gather them in their hands till they had a bunch. And it's kind of like a fly swish. It would look like it was this really satisfying thing to hold. It was very, very heavy, and it had these, the rice would hang on there, which was a problem because you had to get that off to eat it, and then you'd have to get the whole of the rice off to eat it, and then you'd have to polish the rice, which was taking the colored outer endosperm, I guess it is, off, and then it was ready to be cooked. But it was just so satisfying to like have these in your hand, and then you'd fill a basket full, and then, the basket would be carried in and it'd be put up above the cookhouse, which was a small, mud house behind most houses. And it would be put up in the rafters where the smoke could come up through it, and it would discourage the insects and stuff like that. And that was your food for the year. That was your starch. There are a few other things. There's cassava and other things like that. But these were economies where a family would be $200 a year, $300 a year. And that was their food. And, almost everything came from nearby, or it was caught in the ocean and dried and brought, there was smoked fish and dried fish, that sort of thing. But almost everything was from nearby. And people, it's almost a cliche to say people knew all the plants and what they could do, but it's it's mind-boggling how people knew plants and what was good for rope and what was good for stuffing in a wound and what was good for food and what was, they just knew everything. And not only that, but not only adults, but little kids. Once I hit my hand this wasn't a little kid to help me. Once I hit my hand with a machete, there's the scar right there. And I took a glove off, and there's blood. Every heartbeat, blood was shooting about 8 inches. And I go, well, this could be bad, And the guy I was with ran in the bush, came back, was chewing something furiously, and he stuffed it in there and wrapped it. And I took off for the hospital then too. But he just knew what would work, or if you got stung by something, or they knew analgesic plants. They just, there was a huge body of knowledge. So anyway, you have this upland rice, and as the population has increased over the centuries, those farms have to go back to the same area. Instead of every 25 years, then it's every 20 years, and it's every 15 years, and it's every 10 years, and it's every 5 years. And tropical rainforests have very little soil nutrients. It's all up in the canopy and stuff like that. And you take that all down and burn it, the soil pretty much has one crop, or maybe you can squeeze 2 out of it, but a lot of times there were 2 crops there. So it's starting to be a problem with increased population that you can't do slash and burn anymore. So there had been some rice grown in swamps, but you go to Southeast Asia, and the Chinese have, fields that are 4,000 years old. They're grown in the swamps, and they're continually putting not only water and nutrients coming downstream, but they're using night soil, and there's all that kind of stuff is going on just to keep these swamps fertile. And a 1 acre upland rice farm might yield you 4 bushels. A 1 acre swamp farm might yield you 40 bushels. So the project I was on was really trying to plant a Chinese agricultural method into an African agricultural method. And you can discuss the pros and cons and the goods and the bads and the uglies and the beautiful, all that, but it was a much more highly productive system that didn't require outside inputs from the people who had just stolen all your rutile and diamonds. It was like you could still do it here. And it was considered a pretty successful Peace Corps project, unlike a lot of Peace Corps projects. And so my days were, I would spend, every day running around to 2 or 3 different, I had about 12 villages that I worked at, and, 1 to 5 farmers in every one, and some big communal swamps. And so all that kind of stuff. And so the first year you were chopping down swamp foliage, which, if you can imagine mud that you have to tread water in, and trying to chop down palm tree
Sounds heavy.
it's a wooden axe about this big, this long, and a real long metal blade. And palm trees are real fibrous kind of trees, and you're chopping those down, and there's mambas, and there's all kinds of stuff, and there's thorns. And so you run a drain down. You actually build a head bund, which is a big dam at the top, which is still open. And then you run a drain from the middle of that all the way down to where you're going to be done developing. And so you start pulling the water out. And eventually you close that dam. And it's a structure that you close, or you can close and open, but you send the water around to channels outside the swamp. And then if you can imagine a swamp as a thing going down like this, getting lower as it goes. So each of those, so this one is higher than this one, and this one is higher than this one, this one is higher than this one. And then if you go this way down to the drain, it's the same thing, higher, lower, down to the drain. So you have this kind of chute, I guess you'd say. And each one of those has to be leveled. So there's individual bunds for each one of those.
What's a bund?
A bund is a small dam that you can walk on to separate the bed. So instead of getting this shape, you get this stair step down.
Mhm.
There's a bund at each one of those, and then they also stair step that way down the swamp. So the lowest point in the swamp is at the bottom of the drain, and the highest is at the top. And the whole thing, you can control the water to fill those up. And these were East Asian rices. Most of them came from the International Rice Research Institute, which is in the Philippines. There's thousands of varieties of rice, some of which are Green Revolution varieties that respond to fertilizers and all that kind. There's others that will grow in highly saline water. Or in saline water anyway. There's
Mhm.
others that will send the panicle, the flowering head up 20, 30 feet. So if you're in an area where there's like high and low tides, or where the water is low and then it gets fairly high, these rices can just continue to grow clear up to the top. You harvest them from boats, that sort of thing. There's all kinds of varieties, and so a lot of we would try to get varieties, and a lot of them were based on taste and what people they liked the taste of that one. I mean, that
Sure.
was. I mean, is there what you eat every day is how you spend your life, kind of too. And so
Mhm.
they were very interested in that. The yields were important, whether it smelled, how it cooked. I mean, there was a whole raft of things that people were interested in that it's kind of funny. Was it Monsanto? And I think it was the Ford Foundation's tried one of the first biogenetic rices was a thing called golden rice. And they developed it because it had vitamin A, I guess, or vitamin D, whichever it was, the sunshine vitamin.
Mhm.
Do you know? I can't
I
think of
think
the name.
D. I think vitamin D is the sun one. Yeah.
Anyway, that was their point. They said this will prevent blindness and all this kind of stuff. People hated the taste of it, and there's no way they were going to grow it. And yet you had these scientists going, well, this will save the world. And by the way, Monsanto put very little money into it. It was only the Ford Foundation that put money into it, and it was a throw off because they were interested in Roundup. That's where they wanted to go, and so
Mhm.
they needed to do something that would actually benefit people and not production agriculture, which is
Yeah.
a totally different world. So anyway, you had to be careful about what kind of rices, and you did rice trials, and people said, I want more of that, or I don't want to ever see this again, that sort of thing. And so
Were you involved in that part? Like deciding what kind
we
of
get
rice?
well, we get several varieties to try every year,
Mm.
and I don't know how they got in country. Probably the Ministry of Agriculture, that sort of thing, because this country at the same time is importing the same rice from East Asia in milled rice ready to eat too. So there's a lot of
Mhm.
rice coming in, and still is to this day. Even though that one little country could do all the rice you'd need in West Africa, if
Mm.
the swamps were developed as the Chinese had done over so many thousands of years. Um,
Mhm.
so that's what I did for years and years. And I had groups of farmers in all these villages, and I'd go visit them and help them and do some of the work and all that kind of stuff, and got to know them really well. um, I remember one swamp we had I think 8 or 10 farmers, and there was one really old woman. I mean old, and I said, let's have a competition to see who's the best farmer. And of course, she didn't chop down any trees, but once you could plant those patties, she just blew everybody out. I mean, she was the one who would go out every day and put a plant back up if it had fallen over. A lot of people just didn't have time for that kind of stuff, or thought they didn't have time. So she was her, I'll use the word husbandry of that field was just superb. I mean, she just
Yeah.
worried about every plant, and it showed at the end. She had the best thing. She was kind of a feeble, but what she could do, she did.
Yeah.
The other thing, so that was in 1976, 77, 78, 79 in Sierra Leone. It was sweet, a sweet, sweet country. Since that time, they've had Ebola. They had a massive civil war that was just bloody, and these villages were invaded, and that was over money and power, other people over the diamonds, all that kind of stuff. So I would call them, well, they're called blood diamonds. There's a movie out about Sierra Leone called Blood Diamond, if you're ever, and it's pretty realistic, or at least the diamond part of it. So they've had COVID. So they've had all these things that just blew the country up and blew it apart. And the war has been over for about 10 or 12 years, and things are starting to settle down. And I have a friend who's spends time there quite a bit. A lot of the Peace Corps volunteers that I knew or were there at the same time have started projects on their own in Sierra Leone. There's one's done 40 some schools, and a friend of mine is working with a young guy who would be a grandson of the people I was working with, and their rice swamp. His parents were killed. The rice swamps fell apart. All that kind of stuff. He now has a cell phone, and can send videos of what's going on. Which just when I was there, you had to go schedule a satellite. A satellite dish at 3 a.m. to make a satellite call. So you never did. I mean, I had one call in those years. Now I can talk to this guy, right now if I wanted to, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So he and his brothers and sisters, all of whom are now in one way or another in school, which was also not common then.
For boys or girls, neither one went to school?
Boys and girls all went to, I mean, not all of them. You had to have a school. I mean, there were, 80% of the villages didn't have schools. But if you did have a school, generally boys and girls both went up through about 7th or 8th grade. And then there were high schools, which meant leaving that village and moving to one of the regional towns. And then there were a couple of colleges. And they were, okay. They were British system and all that kind of stuff. But so this guy has been sending me videos of the rice swamp that his parents had, which had fallen into disrepair for 2 reasons. One was the war and everybody died and they couldn't take care of it. The other was diamond digging. And I've got, if you go to Substack, my Substack, there's a one called Rice and Diamonds or something like that. And it's a story about diamond diggers. Once we got all those palm trees and the swamp dried out so you could walk into it. Here, I've got a cat that wants to get here.
So cute. Right on there.
Then it became an easy one to prospect for diamonds. There are some diamond chimneys up in the northeast of the country, but then all the rivers flow from there. And so there's alluvial diamonds all the way down to the coast. And there's a level of alluvial gravel that probably was laid down 500,000 years ago, whatever, when some great flood thing. And it's under all that rich humus that you find in swamps. And once it's easy to get to because somebody chopped all the trees down and drained the swamps, you'll see these prospectors will show up and start digging, It ruins the swamp. I mean, it takes all that humus and throws it out, and you've got all this gravel there and a big hole in the middle of it, And so that's happened quite a bit. And there's a story you could read about that if you want to.
Yeah.
So this guy's sending me videos, and he's interviewing his sister and his mother and everybody else out in the swamps, and they're learning to grow rice again as we had done it back then. And they go, "Hey, this makes us some money." I mean, they're surprised at the economy that they find there. It just sort of wasn't there before. So that's a project that it was well received. It fell apart. It's got another generation coming back to it because they see the benefit of it. I think they're still using those Southeast Asian rices when they can get the seed, that sort of thing. So it's sort of like the American part and the Chinese part is gone. But the 20-year-olds and the 30-year-olds are going, huh? There's no other economy here, So
Mhm.
it's kind of made a comeback there.
Mm.
From there, so I spent 2 years doing that.
Yeah, so like while you were there, um, and I even have questions, like you said, about like people dying of malaria when they go to Africa, like when you're getting ready.
I almost died of malaria.
Well, that's what I want to, like, I want to know about, like, when you were there. Yeah, did you ever, yeah, it sounded like you had to go to the hospital with the machete cut. And did you go to the
Yeah,
hospital with your
I got
malaria?
malaria. Well, there are good malaria drugs, and they make you feel weird. And most volunteers at some point go, I'm going to see if I can, just use mosquito nets and get away from it. And then they come down with malaria. And I think I probably did that. And I got malaria and malaria is a really debilitating disease. And so at one point I went to the same hospital, and they gave me, and you take, at the time you were taking something called chloroquine, quinine, quinine, like tonic in a gin and tonic.
Mm-hmm.
That's why the British were drinking all those gin and tonics, all that quinine, which is an extremely bitter. It's tree bark from South America, and a tree, and it's the bark from it. And so the gin and the quinine part offers some protection against malaria. So chloroquine, aliquot, there's a whole bunch of malarial drugs that were based on that. I think they've probably gone beyond that quite a ways since I was there.
Sure.
So, so I got malaria. I went to the hospital. It was bad enough that they gave me a shot in my butt. I think they gave me 2 shots in the butt. And then I got malaria drug overdose, which was way, way worse than malaria. I was, it was tossing nightmares, night sweats kind of thing. And I ended up in the hospital with that for a day or two. Yeah, probably a couple of days. But I lived, and
Clearly.
yeah.
So what is their healthcare system like over there?
Well, I mean, Africa's, 4 or 5 times the size of the United States. So, and it has been divided by the French and the Germans and the British and the Portuguese and the Spanish and everybody else. So it's got different healthcare in all those. And, but it was all originally designed for to keep the Europeans healthy. And if you happen to be near there, you had some health care. And then I think they got a little more charitable as things. I mean, British did end slavery, so I think there were, impulses to try to be decent. So I'm sure they were overridden almost all the time, but there were, those impulses were there, and I think missionaries, things that people like that tried to establish healthcare. They tried to establish schools, those sorts of things, and now there's, there are educated Africans, physicians, all that kind of stuff. The money's still not there. I mean, there's more flow of dollars out of Africa than ever are going to go back in there. And Europeans, if they would think about it, would realize how their way of life is based on other people's wealth from over 400 years. I mean, they just took it, I mean, and not that Europeans were worse than anybody else. I think you can find examples of in any culture of empire, people willing to take people's stuff. It's just, that's the one what we know about and we lived in. But I mean, the Romans were taking stuff out of Africa and Africans were taking things from other Africans and all that kind of stuff. I think
it's more human nature.
The bad part of human nature is there right along with the good part of human nature. And the examples are the ones who are really successful being bad, and that's who history records as powerful and, innovative and all that
Yeah.
kind of stuff.
Yeah,
So
they were so successful in their exploitation that
yeah.
we remember them, unfortunately. Anyways.
Anyway, back to, I don't know what else there is to say about Sierra Leone other than
Wait, I had one other question. Where did you live? Like, did you have your own place or did you live with a family or what was that like?
in Sierra Leone, I had a house. It was, as you came in the village, there was a road. You could hear a car for 10 miles. A car is coming, and everybody would know a car's coming.
Like a newsworthy event. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was on the entry to the house. It was right across from the school. The school was a newer building. I mean, it wasn't a new building, but it was, had concrete in the walls. And then there was this house that the paramount chief, whose name was Chief Bio, had built as it was going to be used as a rest house. It had a latrine, it had no running water, it had no lights, any of that kind of stuff. But it had, it wasn't exactly concrete walls. It was mud and concrete formed into bricks that looked like a cinder block, but they weren't as strong as a cinder block. I remember in my latrine, which was just in the back, there was the latrine hole, and there was a place to wash, and there was a little, like elbow high wall separating that, and it was dark, and I would take a candle to use the place. You had to take a candle. I remember taking a candle out, and I'd put it, drop some hot wax on that little wall and set the candle in. And one day the candle fell over and pulled out a chunk of the brick about this big. Like, well, that's not a very strong wall. There was also a spitting cobra that lived in that latrine, and so I would let him know I'm coming. It's like, hey, I'm coming in here. That kind of thing. Give him a chance to get out of there. I saw him many, many times, but we coexisted. That's.
I don't know if I'd be able to do that.
Yeah.
That's probably one of the biggest, just living anywhere more close to nature. Yeah, like all the bugs, all the critters, all the creepy crawly things that.
Well, in tropical forests, you get lots of those things. I mean,
Yeah. When you said about like you were chopping the brush, the palm trees and stuff, you said there were mambas.
Yeah, green mambas.
What is that?
It's a snake, a highly poisonous snake. And Sierra Leoneans, I mean, these villagers just hated snakes. And if they saw a snake of any kind, they went after it. I mean, they chased it. Snakes were people were sources of fear for snakes more than snakes were sources of fear for people. If a snake saw a human, it got going. And where you'd have incidents, it's like a guy climbing a palm tree to tap palm wine would come across a mamba up in the tree and couldn't, they met and he got bit and he died. And in an animist society, most people would say, well, somebody sent that snake to get him. Some evil cognizance wanted him dead. And that's why, there was no happenstance where you run across a snake. There was who did this? What entity, human or otherwise, did this that caused this guy, so
that's fascinating.
Part of the deal. I remember once I was in a swamp with two guys, and we were, clearing it with machetes and stuff like that. And these two, a man and a woman, were screaming clear across the swamp, and they came running at us. And in front of them was a green mamba, panicked, going, and coming straight at us. I look at my little machete and I go, ugh. And one of the guys I was with feels the same, and he pulled out a huge palm frond, like a 12-foot, 15-foot long palm frond, and he whacks it. But that snake was leaping at us, 4 feet off the ground, mouth wide open, trying to, it was pretty. So have I convinced you to go to Sierra Leone?
I don't like it at all.
I probably saw 5 of those over my 2 or 3 years there.
Would you say that's like the scariest thing that ever happened to you, or do you got other things in your life that are scarier than that?
No,
No,
there are rattlesnakes and copperheads around here. It's like Africa's not
not
where you
special because they got snakes. Yeah,
that could happen here. That could
sure.
happen
Oh
miles
God,
from here.
not a big fan. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. So that sounds pretty rustic. So no electricity, no
No
lights,
electricity, no
no.
running water.
How'd you
I would
cook?
go get my own water every day. So I'd walk with a bucket and, about a mile, and down into where there was clean looking water. It had schistosomiasis in it, and it had other stuff. And then I'd take it home and either boil it or filter it, and then I could drink it, or I put iodine in it.
Uh-huh.
I remember once, Africans carry things on their heads, and we go, how rustic. And I remember once going down with a little girl, a 7-year-old girl. She had a bigger bucket than I had. And we went down there and she filled up her bucket and I helped her get it on her head. And then I think I had two, it was like a 6-gallon bucket and I had 2 4-gallon buckets. And then we walked back together. And I had to stop several times, but she didn't have to stop. And I'm going, well, there's some sense in this carrying things on your head. You'd see women with an entire tree on their head. And there's a way to make your spine perfectly, up and down. And the women would it would be a trimmed tree, but it would be 15 foot long, 20 foot long, that big around. And you pick up one end and they would walk underneath it until the balance point, tip it up, and away they go. And if you came up on them on a motorcycle on the road, they would invariably stop and turn to see what was coming. This tree would come out and block the road, and so you always had to be aware of that. But I remember running into a woman here at the lake, and she was trying to put her kayak up onto the roof of her Subaru, and she just, upper arm strength, it just wasn't there. And so I showed her how to put one end up there and then walk the other end up, and there you go. It's just a thing that we don't think about because I'll have that guy load it for me.
Sure.
That sort of
Sure.
thing, but it's that, people are carrying stuff, heavy things all the time, and it's on their heads.
Mm-hmm. Well, like you said, they use their bodies way more than what we
Oh
have.
yeah,
We have tools
they
and
were a lot stronger, wiry, every day they were doing
yeah,
things that Americans have never done. So
don't even think about it.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, that's very interesting. So is it normal for Peace Corps assignments to be 2 years? Is that like their normal thing? Yeah. So when you come to the end of that, what were you thinking as far as like what's coming next?
Yeah. I was thinking I'm starting to be competent in Africa. Shame to quit, now that I am not just the wide-eyed idiot walking around.
Sure.
And the other thing is during those 2 years there, that particular country, Sierra Leone, was known for its trainings in villages. Like a lot of trainings take place in Puerto Rico, or they take place in some of them took place down in South Carolina, in Gola country, especially for Sierra Leone, where there's the language is almost the Creole and Gola. I mean, I can talk to Gola people because that's where they came from, and they managed to retain their culture. But generally, you're trained in DC, or you're trained in the suburbs of DC or someplace like that, and then you go over there and get a little more cultural training and stuff. But Sierra Leone was known for its training out in villages, and they would go to a village if the village agreed. And they would be way out in the bush, and you would repair a room in everybody's house in town, and that was going to be for the Peace Corps volunteer. But then 3 months, they're out of there, and you've got concrete floor and reframed window and all that kind of stuff, they'd maybe do a well. They do a BAFA, which was like a big meeting area for the classes and stuff like that. And then volunteers would come and live with families and get to know them, pretty well. I mean, often there's no ceiling. I mean, so you're just in partition. The houses would have partitions, and so it was like whatever you're doing, everybody knows what you're doing. I mean, that's sort of the way it was,
Sure.
and so that was a really good way to train people. And other countries hadn't done it before, but Sierra Leone was known for that. So I during the season when not much was going on, we'd hold our trainings, and in those trainings, I mean, we would develop a swamp. People would go early and work with the village and clear and have a swamp mostly cleared, but then not all, so that the volunteers, new volunteers, got trained in how to do that and how to build the bunds, how to do transit level surveys, or how to do it if you don't have a transit level, that kind of stuff. They'd have crops growing in various, like in a nursery, and a seedling nursery, have some growing at certain stages of the crop, so that in the 3 months that the volunteers were there, they would see a whole crop season. They would see how to build a swamp, and as did the villagers all there too. And then you'd leave that swamp there, and you'd leave all that kind of stuff. So it was a sweet deal to put up with a bunch of weird Americans for a while. And some volunteers should not be there. I mean, it's pretty clear there are people that they're running from something, and they latched on, and as opposed to people who wanted to be there, who had just the most enjoyable time. Some of them could still misbehave, but some people were just, should not have been there, and I ran several trainings for Peace Corps volunteers, and I would say it's like 30% are just great, 50%, 60% are. It's going to be a 2-year experience, ups and downs, but they'll get through that. And then some are just, they should have stayed home, but they probably shouldn't have been at home either. I mean, I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
It's that kind of thing. It's like the Foreign Legion. It draws people who want to adventure, and it draws people who can't find a place.
Yeah.
Think about the gold rush in this country. In 1840s, half the young men, I don't know, a lot of the young men in the country just skedaddled for this lawless, that's another human nature thing, that once people could travel, I mean, maybe you're out there catching beaver and bringing the pelts back, but that's like a way to not be unhappy back east,
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's that going on too,
I could see that, where like the Peace Corps is a way to travel. And you keep saying like a Peace Corps volunteer, you don't get paid. Do they pay for your living expenses, or like how does that part work?
You wouldn't be the richest person in your village, but you were clearly, you got a $100 equivalent of $100 a month for if you had to pay rent, and that was your food and your travel and stuff like that, which was more than enough. I mean,
in a country where you said some families make like $200 or $300 in a year.
Yeah, for a family of 4 or 5 or 6.
Yeah, and you got $100 a month. That sounds.
Yeah, you were an elite person, but there were still people richer than you there. But there were people way poorer. Most people were way poorer than you.
Yeah.
And you had health. You had, if you could get medevac back to the U.S. if you had a serious enough health crisis, and you had use of a motorcycle.
Is that how you got between, like you said, you went to all the different villages and worked with all the farmers?
If it wasn't within walking distance, I rode a motorcycle. And then you ride public transport, which is generally like the village that I was in was called Tihoon. The president of Sierra Leone is from that village and was probably a toddler when I was there. I didn't know him, And that village also had the biggest massacre during the war. There were 800 people massacred there. So I just kind of wonder whether I would know anybody there now. But anyway, it had one like Datsun pickup that had a canopy built up on a really strong canopy. A little Datsun pickup, stub nose kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it could carry 40 to 50 people, more than a school bus. It had a bench on each side and a bench down the middle. And they put you in with your knees layered, so the people in the middle were going both ways, and then their knees were layered between everybody. And at times, if there were passengers that wanted to get on and couldn't get in, they would take off, go real fast, slam on the brakes. Everybody would slide to the front, and they'd put 2 or 3 more people on. And then there were, chickens under there, and there's chickens on the side, and there's goats on the roof, and young men on the roof, and people hanging. I mean, it was just, and I was in situations like that all the time. I went to, this was in Senegal, and there's this a Muslim sect called the Murids, and they have a city called Touba, and they do a pilgrimage there every year. And it's not like the pilgrimage to Mecca, but it's a small version with 1 million people that come. And it's those trains where you can't see the train, that's just like people hanging on the sides, and the vehicle. It's just, that's what public transport was. I don't know where I'm going with that.
Slam on the brakes and you all go forward. That was great. Yeah. Okay. So yes, you participated in the trainings while you were there the first 2 years.
Yeah, I would
and
do
you
like
got
I do some of the training on rice, or some of the training on or cross-cultural stuff. And so I went to 2 of those, and that gave me chops as a trainer, which we talked about doors that opened. So that opened the door to this request from Mali that I come up there and serve as a volunteer for a year, and then set up their first village-based training. So I was in Mali for 2 years, but 1 year as a volunteer, and 1 year as director of their training.
Yeah.
In Mali, I was up near Timbuktu. So, I mean, the center of West Africa, basically. It's not in the center, but it's right at the base of the Sahara. So it's in the Sahel, extremely dry. 75 miles north, there were no one living, but you could traverse the, down from Libya and Algeria and places like that. And there was one thing really north of us, and it was the salt mine, which was also the prison of Mali. And if you were a prisoner, that's where you went to die. It was.
And they had you like work at the salt mine, or?
Oh yeah. That's what it was. And so a lot of the caravans you saw there were, camels with, it's rock salt. So they'd be tablets like this big and this big, 3.5 by 2.5 feet, and one on each side. I mean, heavy rock, on each side of the camel, and you'd see these long caravans coming down, and they'd go to markets and stuff like that. The way you sell it is you sit there with that big tablet of rock between your feet and basically a wood saw, and you just saw off little chunks, and you sell chunks to women who come to the market, and that's the salt, And I mean, there's other sea salt places in West Africa, but in Central Africa, that was, it's a valuable commodity. So where I was near Timbuktu, that's where Mansa Musa lived. So I don't know, 1400s, 1500s, he was considered perhaps the richest man in the world. All the gold. He went to Mecca and basically collapsed the economies of Egypt and Saudi Arabia, because the inflation from all this free gold that he was throwing around to people, that just like gold was suddenly worth nothing, because he had some. Look at Mansa Musa, look him up. It's an interesting.
I will. Yeah.
Guy that nobody really knows about.
Huh.
So I was up there, and the Peace Corps part of it was it was a USDA, U.S. Department of, or USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development funded project. And the farmers up there were growing wheat, short straw wheat, which would be the equivalent of spring wheat, not like our hard red winter wheat from Europe. And they were growing it in the Sahel, or the Niger River, after which the country of Niger and Nigeria are named, starts to the north of Syria. I was about 800 miles away from where I was at Sierra Leone. So that river starts in the north, in the Guinea-Bissau, in the Futa Jalon Mountains, and it travels north and becomes a braided stream, like a very wide braided stream with sandbars and stuff like that. And it turns not far after Timbuktu and then heads back south and through Niger and Nigeria, and it spills out into the ocean way down there. So it's a really long river, and also is a dry season, rainy season river. So at times it's in full flood and it's huge and stuff like that. Other times it's a braided stream with boats tilted on their side, waiting for the rainy season to get back up and go and stuff like that. And there's a lot of people use the river for transport. There's a tribe of people called the Bozo, who are river people, and they're nomadic river people, so they move back and forth. And the typical boat is a panas, which is a huge, always black canoe made with planks like this. Where those planks come from now, I don't know. So basically sewn together and then pushed with long poles. So the people that push that poles are the fittest people that I've ever seen on the planet Earth. I mean, they are basically spending 8 to 10 hours a day exerting every muscle in their body. And you should see everyone, they're just you can just see every muscle, that sort of thing. They stop to eat and they'll eat this much rice, it's just like pour that at the end, and just really fit people. So I was up there, and the ID project was trying to increase the amount of wheat, which had been grown there for centuries. And the way they were doing it was trying to give them mechanized pumps. So the way in the dry season, the river gets braided and it goes down to a small stream. And what they're called the Koroboro or the Sangrai would do is they dig a canal with a short hand hose, 15 feet deep and a quarter mile. So if you can imagine a small short hoe with a blade like that, digging in the mud and flinging it 15 foot up for a quarter mile. I mean, you couldn't get across them. They were so deep.
Yeah.
And then when they got to where their fields were, they would build a settling pool like 6 foot up. And then they'd build another settling pool, or another pool above that, 6 foot up, another pool above that, or maybe they would be at the level of the field. So then they'd take this, it would be inner tube buckets with 2 ropes on them, and they'd scoop the water down and throw it over their shoulder to the pond, to the little pool above. Then they'd climb up there and take the water and throw it to the next pool above. And then they'd climb up there and take the water and throw it into their fields. And the fields had little canals and stuff like that. And then basically little patties. And then the water would sink down in. It was so dry there at times on a dry day, you could see wheat sitting in 3 inches of water and the tops desiccating because of the dry wind that was going over. But these guys were just superb farmers. They were just, compared to the Sierra Leone farmers who were, good farmers, these guys were just like, God, they worry about every plant. They on a moonlit night, they were out working. They'd work all night if the moon was full, that sort of thing. the men had forearms like this from all that. You know, the thing they carried, the sacks, they were woven sacks that they carried wheat in. They were 300-pound sacks. And so two guys would get together and one would hold the other guy's wrist and they'd tip the sack into him. And then they'd carry those sacks wherever they needed to go. I mean, nobody could lift one of those sacks, but these guys, 150 pounds for each of them, they were fine. And so that's, and at one point it was 128 degrees for like a week. And fortunately it was full moon. People went out and farmed all night. And then during the day, everybody, they had mosquito nets and they took them outside their house because you couldn't stay in the house. And everything, the donkeys, the goats, the cattle, everything was like, humans, you just couldn't do things at 128 degrees.
Yeah.
But 105 at night, you could, that was like,
Great.
Some relief,
Yeah, exactly. Oh, what's that kitty's name?
That's Vera.
Vera wanted to be on the podcast. Hi, Vera. Welcome to my grocery adventure. Oh gosh. Wow. Okay. So
what we were doing was introducing Pakistani pumps. So they were diesel pumps. Very simple pump. But if there's one place in the world where there's no diesel fuel, it's Timbuktu. I mean, there's no year-round road or truck transport. The river's not year-round, stuff like that. So it all had to come up the river or during the dry season and stuff like that. And government couldn't do it. Traders would do it, but then people would accuse them of gouging. But I mean, they don't, here's what it costs to get this. So the diesel was a real issue. If the pumps break down, we were training mechanics. The garage that we had to repair it was a mat on top of some sticks. So you'd break down the diesel pump and you'd come back in the morning and there'd be a drift of sand inside the piston, and all that kind of stuff. So it was just continually trying to do that. And my job was working with extension agents, and all of whom had never grown wheat before. They were all from the South, had been through the French-based agricultural school. Everybody, they didn't speak the same language as the Koroboro. They spoke Bambara. And they were and then because it was a funded project, the government, I mean, all these countries have people who've gone through some education, and then they need to, give them a job. And so if there's a outside funded project, you just pack them in there, whether they want to go or not. So there were a lot of people there. I mean, some were just excellent, and some were like hoping for their paycheck, which they sometimes didn't get. Some of them didn't know anything about growing wheat or that sort of thing. They could look it up, I guess. And meanwhile, these farmers have been growing it for 500 years. So you couldn't teach them a lot about wheat. You could teach them about, okay, you're going to have a much bigger stream of water coming here. We're going to have to redesign this because right now your canal's going like this and all over, and you need to come up with a way to allow this larger stream to come through, that sort of thing. I remember I met a farmer. He was growing some rice too, and I said, and he was planting the plants so far apart, and I said, man, because I knew something about rice at the time. I said, this is just not right. And he goes, yeah, it is. And I said, no, it's not. I said, well, would you let me do it? And he said, well, if you'll repay me if this doesn't go well. And I said, okay. And so I just one little plot, like 6 foot by 6 foot, and I planted the rice a lot closer together. Came back a few months later. Mine was all burned down and nothing, and his was this lush thing because it was a type of rice that really tillered. So it was a rice that had 100 stems as opposed to 5 stems or something like that. So he was right. He knew what he's doing. I did not. I had to buy him a bag of oats, I think it was, for his horse. And he got to.
What made you think you knew better than the guy who like grew it
Because I
full
knew about
time?
rice, and nobody knew about rice up there. So he was,
Okay.
but he did know about. He did know
But
about
you didn't
that
know.
variety
Yeah.
of rice. You know, it was really funny.
We've all been there.
There were two guys. So we had this field that it was, we trialed varieties. These were Mexican varieties. So CIMMYT is IRRI was the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines. CIMMYT is the Wheat and Maize Institute. These are like international research. There's another one, ICRISAT, I think in India, that does sorghums. And then there's a potato one in Peru. So CIMMYT would send us varieties that we could try, and yeah, that was okay. Some of them worked, some of them didn't, but they had their own varieties too, and which were well adapted and well suited. But these CIMMYT things, in theory, would have more yield, less straw. I don't know, those sorts of things. So we had a research station that I spent a lot of time on too. And like I would set up these irrigation systems that could deal with the pump, and then we did varietal trials and stuff like that. And we bring farmers to come look at it. The people that were there, and so I spent a lot of days there. And the people that worked there were Bella, and the Bella people are Black Africans. They are traditionally, they're commonly found in Tuareg encampments and are considered a slave tribe of the Tuareg. So the Tuareg are Maghrebian. They speak Arab. They look a little more Arabic. They're known as the blue people. They wear blue indigo turbans around their head. Very, very different people. And so there's some stories on my Substack about them too that are kind of interesting. But they were very hospitable and all that kind of stuff. But they were also, they made you worry when you're around them for whatever reason. They didn't smile a lot. But anyway, there was this couple, the Bella couple, and they were no longer anybody's property, And the Bella and the Tuaregs lived together for generations. So it's like you might say a servant master relationship. So it'll go on for generations, that sort of thing. But these two had escaped, and they were the poorest people I'd ever seen. They had a mat. They had a little goat. They had a tin can about this big, I think, kind of a empty tin can. They had their clothes, probably a few coins in their pockets. Maybe a water, a clay bowl, and a calabash. That's what they had.
What's a calabash?
It's a big gourd bowl. So
okay. Like carry big stuff.
Yeah, or keep food in it or whatever. Okay. So their house was this little sticks in the ground, making a kind of round thing and they had a winnowing basket, which was the door at other times. So I would go. That's where I spent many of my days, was out with them, and I would bring bread, or there's a really nice. The one luxury up there was a thing called takala, which was a whole wheat pita that puffed up really big, and it was like, this tastes good. This is good, and you get clarified butter and you put it on it. But anything else was like, man, it was sand. You're eating sand and not great cuisine. But so I'd bring that, or I'd bring tea out or something like that, and we'd spend the day and we'd work together and eat lunch and all that kind of stuff.
Huh.
There's another story about them. It's called the Big Storm, I think, or something like that. Anyway, it's a funny thing. Well, just quickly.
Sure.
So I'm out there with them. First and only rain in the year and a half I was up there came. It was a big black storm rolling in, and we're going, oh crap, and we have this little sticks in the ground with a mat over it kind of thing. So the three of us beat it to there, and the little goat comes running. He scoots in there too. So we're sitting in there, and we hear these two women who are coming, also walking from Dire, which was probably 12, 15 kilometers away, back to their home village. And they both had babies on the back, and one was burned, which is why they went down had burned its hands in a fire pot or something, which is why they'd gone to Dire to seek medical thing. And this little kid was on the back, and I remember he had white gauze on his hands, and they looked like pistils on a flower. They were just like, or stamens. Anyway, they were just
a little part.
Yeah. But they came, they had, big things on their head full of stuff, because it was a long trip, and they were hit back, and this thing was coming, and they were panicking. They came running, and we opened the door, and they dove in, all four of them. And we're all kind of sitting there going, geez, what is going to happen here? And then suddenly around this mat door, a toad comes hopping and gets in with us. And it just cracked us all up, because here's this white guy from Nebraska, and these Bella, and these two samurai with their burning kids, and a goat and
a toad.
And all of us had the same instinct, like, what is
covered?
Oh
my gosh.
We just cracked up, and it came through, and it really blew, it's like, yeah, but it didn't take us down. And there was about an inch of rain, which was an amazing amount of rain. I mean, that was all the rain I ever saw there. And so the mud that is at the base of the Niger River, when it's dry, is like rock. It's like hard as rock. When it's wet and you walk in it, you get that much builds up on the bottom of your feet. So trying to get out of there and get back down, at least down to the beach where the sand was along the river, to get home. And I got home, and I had half a building. So I had one room, and my landlady was an elderly, I think, widow. And it's unusual to see somebody living alone like that, but she was renting me half her house, which was great for her. And my house was, the door, you could, it was various pieces of flat wood that was 50, 80, 100 years old, with holes in it and stuff like that. And sand floor, mud walls with air. It was sticks with some manure and mud, and then more mud packed on top. Well, rain and mud, right? Rain and this stuff. And mine dripped a lot, but her half of the house cracked open, and it just broke open and fell in two. And I was going, oh no. And she was so happy, because she was going to get a new house. It was like, finally, it finally went. So, and then, within, I don't know, 3 weeks, they had another house up, that kind of thing. So she was very happy about that.
Great.
Anyway, that's a little side story.
An inch of rain in
I was 35 kilometers from Timbuktu, and I got there once. That is a hard place to get to.
Really?
And that took 2 days to get there from where I was. So
why is so hard to get there? Like, just the
no
terrain?
roads, no, you could charter an airplane to get there, that sort of thing. But it is just a hard. And then when the river's full, you can get there. But it's 10 days from Bamako, from the capital. So it's just
no wonder that's the saying,
Yeah. But at one point, it had maybe one of the largest libraries in the world. It had the richest man in the world. It's got some mosques that are approaching 700 years old. It wasn't a backwater at one point.
Yeah. Well, probably any place on earth has a varied history. It's not just what it is now.
Anyway, that project, I'd really be surprised if those diesel pumps are long gone. It was a Western idea of how to be helpful if you don't consider all the logistical and infrastructure needs a place has, and just say, we'll just pop this in and this will work. And I don't think it worked at all.
Yeah.
So I saw some really bad projects. And
Well, and
And
that probably happens a lot where
oh,
somebody's sitting on the other side of the world thinking like this is genius and it's got
yeah,
this and this, and then somebody tastes it and it's gross, or there's no diesel, so the diesel pumps don't work, or
yeah,
like really simple things you would think,
all
but
that stuff.
it goes to show how easy it is for humans to kind of project their own assumptions, their own reality, that like it must be like this. They don't even think that, the infrastructure would be missing.
Well, and remember, these were colonized countries, and Sierra Leone was never an agriculturally colonized country so much, but Mali was, Senegal were, and these were French. The Senegalese, I mean, the French, probably 200 miles, 100 miles, 200 miles south of me. The French were going to turn Mali into their breadbasket. It was going to be the breadbasket of France. And so they had these huge, they call them perimeters of fields irrigated fields laid out. And they had, I mean, they were really a lot of put a lot into it. And then they'd send French people down there, and the French people would all cheat with each other's wives and commit suicide. I mean, there was just tons of stories about, oh, that house, those two guys killed each other. When I was in Bamako, I mean, there's still a lot of French there, and there were four. I was just there for like 3 or 4 months, learning for 3 months, maybe learning French, and there were four French women that committed suicide in that town.
Why? Like, why?
They're so far away. They're into this other culture, and they're lonely, and people start acting strange, and it's just colonialism's a weird thing. And when it was mostly just men, I suppose that was one thing, but um, it's being isolated if you're. I remember Wes Jackson talking about, who Wes Jackson is out in Salina. He's one of the public intellectuals, and he and Wendell Berry are two of the best known sort of agricultural, in that area. And he was talking about visiting Italy and how in the summer the whole village moves out to farm, and then they'd move back, in the winter, and how in this country, in the U.S., it was everybody wanted to be a great house in Britain, so you'd have a house on a here, and then 3 miles farther away there'd be a house here, and how hard that was on. I mean, people are social, and I mean that's not everybody, but a lot of people just this was not a good life.
Mm.
And boy, those colonialists. I mean, they were there to make money. That's what that was all about.
And they probably did. And sounds like they.
Peanuts. Senegal was where the French Empire got all their peanut oil, and they basically got all the farmers to quit growing subsistence food and to grow peanuts, and then use the cash to buy their food, which came from Europe. I mean, and it still exists. I mean, it's still there. Mountains of peanuts that leave.
Huh.
So all these places were viewed as, well, the French said they're either a milk cow or altruism. You leave a big hole, or it's a milk cow. That's why you go to these countries. And hopefully people can still feed themselves while being milked, or while digging the big hole. That kind of thing.
Yeah. What a way to see a big group of people, or a place that is not your home, but somebody else's home. Like,
well, the U.S. came, Europeans came to North America. It's like, well, they're hardly using this place. They're in the way. Somebody pointed out War of the Worlds, where the Martians come, and he said basically it's a story about fumigating a house that you want to live in. And the Martians came, oh, there's all these things here, let's get rid of them, and then it will have I mean, and then how is that different from
what already happened. Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. And I think much like what we talked about on the last episode, where it used to be that war was seen as this thing where we built monuments to it and we were proud of whatever. And then we stopped seeing it that way. We see it a little bit differently now. I think at this point, we are starting to see that, like, those decisions of, invading other places and taking out all their resources, like, that wasn't cool. And actually, there's lots of museums and countries that are like giving back things that they have in their possession. They're like giving it back to the place where it was taken from and like putting it back where it came from.
Do you remember at the start of the Iraq War, 93 or 94, when Dick Cheney wanted to build the largest embassy, U.S. embassy in the world in Baghdad? And it was because of the oil of the, we were going to become, and we controlled Iran's oil for years and years. So he was, the whole idea was, it was, it was Saddam Hussein was a bad guy, and maybe he had something to do with 9/11, but of course he did not. You can find people like that today who look out and go, well, how can I you can find developers in a town. Look at the town and go, how do we get rid of those people and put in nice apartments?
Yeah. We're hardly using this part over here. We could build a bunch more stuff. Yeah. That's like
on the other hand, I kind of look at the green revolution. I go, so you're going to use all this fertilizer and all these high tech varieties, and you're going to use all, when we started doing that, there were 1 billion people. Now there's over 8 billion people, and nutrition is actually better throughout the world than it was. I have to reconsider my own prejudices and impulses too. But you wouldn't have 8 billion people if that nutrition hadn't gotten better. And those people have less control over their food than they ever did before. It's this mixed bag of, things,
Yeah. As always, I feel like we could just keep going and going and going. At some point, what's that?
We've gone for an hour and
I know it's already like an hour and 15 minutes, hour 20 minutes. It can go by so fast. And that's what I hear from the people watching them too. It's like, wow, that hour flew by. So yeah, thank you again, as always, for sharing your stories. I'm gonna get from you a few links to some of the articles that you mentioned, and we'll put those in the description box for anybody who wants to dig into the articles about your time in Africa.
They're written than me telling them.
Well, yeah, there's like so many places and things that, like, as I read the mango one, for example, I Googled the places you were talking about and found a map so I could see, like, where did you start and where did you go? And like, so that was really cool to get to kind of take the story at my own pace and be able to give myself as much context as I needed to be able to understand.
It's a wonderful time we live in from that perspective.
I know. It's just right there. Yeah. I got to see, like, oh, look there's the train tracks that he went on from like his little journey from this place to this place. So yeah, we'll put some links in the description if people want to dig into some of the stories from Africa. And when we come back, do you think, did we get to the end of your Africa years, or are there still more years?
There's a little bit more.
Okay.
And then I'd say after that is being involved in sustainable agriculture in the U.S. And then you'll have drained me dry. I won't have anything left.
We're treating you like the milk cow. We're just getting a little bit more every little bit. Yeah. Well, and so yeah, so next time we'll come back and we'll pick back up in Africa and cover a little bit more of what's left. And then after 8 years on a continent around the other side of the world, like, right, my main question is, how do you decide like what to do next? I'm sure doors opened and kind of the path unfolded like it has been, but yeah, so next time when we come back, we'll catch us up on the rest of Africa and what happened next.
Okay, sounds great.
Okay. Everyone else, thank you for watching. We appreciate it. It's super cool to see people enjoy these episodes. Awesome to get to read any comments or, favorite parts or highlights that you really enjoyed. If you have any questions for Dan, anything you'd like to hear him talk more about, I'm sure he'd be open to answering some of those. So feel free to leave those in the comments as well. And until next time, I hope everybody's taking good care. This is coming out right before the holidays. Hope everybody has a good, safe, enjoyable holiday season. And we'll see you on the next one. Okay, bye.